Okay, welcome everyone. Hi, hello. Welcome to everyone in chat and all the people probably watching the YouTube VOD. Hello to the YouTube viewers. Welcome to the Dark Ages, a lecture by moi, Cleoite. I almost said Sleoite. If you don't know who I am a historian. I like history. I like writing about history. I like researching history. I like reading history. I like playing history games, and I do that on Twitch. So please consider checking me out on twitch.tv/CleoIT. But today we're going to be looking at the Dark Ages. And so, the Dark Ages. You probably are aware of the Dark Ages through popular culture. Some of you guys may have played a little game called Age of Empires. Some of you guys may have played a hit game known as Age of Empires. Hands up in chat. Have you played a game called Age of Empires? Does this look familiar to you? Wait, why is it resizing? No! Ugh. Why are my slides resizing? Wait, what? Huh? Sorry, let me just trim that. Trim that sucker. Does this look familiar? Yeah, well, you might remember, if you've ever played Age of Empires, there's a little sucker over here. You can see my cursor, hopefully. It says Dark Age. And if you are a fan of modern gaming, you might know some other terminology involving the Dark Ages. Wood, please. Rabugya. That's all I can remember from Age of Empires. But you might know also of this little small game that is not out yet, actually, but it's called Doom, the Dark Ages. Is my OBS? No, okay, it's just my end is making it look a bit funky, I think. But yeah, there's this upcoming game called Doom, the Dark Ages. I was tempted to make a meme where I had, like, you shouldn't call it the Dark Ages, or, like, people calling it the Dark Ages, and then it's got, like, a picture of, like, John Romero with a speech bubble coming out saying, I consent, and then an image of a gamer going, I consent, and then just me saying, I don't. Because today we're going to be talking about why the terminology of Dark Ages isn't exactly correct, and is a bit of a misnomer. And so we'll be getting into that first. But when people probably think of the Dark Ages, they're probably thinking of the collapse of the Western Roman Empire and the rise of a period of barbarism, of violence, of stupidity. Essentially, they're thinking of going from this, in which civilization was full of, the world was full of civilized peoples who respected each other and, acted morally and, achieved great things. And so people probably associate the Dark Age with going from, well, times of this to times of this. If you don't recognize this, it's from Monty Python and the Holy Grail, one of my favorite films growing up. One of my favorite films growing up, and definitely helped inspire me to get interested in medieval history. Fun fact. So I felt like I had to include it. Rome was pretty brutal on there, and correct, yes. And we will be getting into that. Because the misnomer that is the Dark Ages does rely on biases and misconceptions about Roman society and life in comparison to the medieval successors, let's say. So yeah, first of all, I will be going over a quick note, sorry. My head is, I might just trim this. How about I get out the way, because I just realized my head's just going to cover the text. Apologies. It also helps that you guys can see chat, I suppose. That'll probably help. I'll wiggle over as well. Wiggle, 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 wiggle. There we go. Ta-da! So yeah, when we're talking about the Dark Ages today, we are specifically referring to the broad era spanning, according to some people, 500 to 1,000 years, which is a pretty big window of time. So there are people who argue that the Dark Ages lasts up until, I think, the fall of Rome, the fall of Constantinople in 1453, which is, it's strange. It's very strange. History and the classification of eras and periodization is a very, very strange, interesting topic. But we're not going to get too deep into periodization today, because periodization is a whole other minefield of historical nonsense. Let's leave it at that. But essentially what we're going to be looking at is the broad era, or the misconception of the entirety of the early medieval period or the late antiquity era, depending on your definition of the time. We're going to be looking at the period around the 500s to sort of, let's say, early 10th century. That's kind of what we're going to be looking at in terms of the definition of what a dark age is, which is using the more sort of traditional definition of the Dark Ages would be referring to the early medieval period. We unfortunately are essentially propagating, a bit of a myth. It's sort of a myth that is, unfortunately, like you saw previously in the previous slide, kind of propagated by pop culture. I don't know why there's a little bit of white screen at the bottom. I might need to... Oh, okay, yeah, I haven't actually cropped it properly. Apologies. Give me a sec. Let me crop that properly. Zoop. There we go. Sorry, I'm not very good at OBS. But yeah, we're going to be talking about that sort of broad era. We're not going to be focusing on any sort of specific areas of history, as there are certain eras of history that do focus on sort of their own history, which refer to time periods as a dark age. So, for example, the Greek Iron Age is often, or has been in the past, referred to as the Greek Dark Age. That's the period from about 1200 to 800 BC. And there's also the British Dark Age, which is the sort of term that is used to describe the post-Roman to pre-Norman conquest, typically focusing on the Saxon invasions. That is kind of what the British Dark Age refers to. It is a terminology that is, I think for certain time periods you may use it as a sort of maybe a valid label of that time period. But unfortunately, using it as a broad terminology for the whole of medieval history, especially European medieval history, is unnuanced periodization that doesn't really help anyone in understanding what happened, which is to say, what were the Dark Ages? There we go. Sorry, I almost got my slides mixed up. Because again, as I mentioned before we started, I've been working on this morning, and then I've been rearranging the slides, so I'm actually not sure the order. So, what were the Dark Ages? So it is a myth about medieval history that is still propagated in popular culture. You see video games, you see film, you see TV, of a society of conflict, social decline, general stupidity, intellectual intellectual decline as well, a return to mud and dirt and living in hovels and people living in squalor, the abandonment of cities and the establishment of rural agriculture as the predominant form of sort of society. But it's not necessarily true. So it's, like I said before, it's typically associated with late antiquity and early medieval history. And so it is one of those awkward situations with periodization, which is a discipline of history which loves to essentially split up history into different categories to make it easier to understand, except we can't actually come to a consensus about what is what and what is something else. And so you end up with, people just essentially arguing over, oh, no, I think the late antiquity ends in this time period. Oh, I think early medieval history starts at this event. And eventually you just kind of go around in circles and arguing semantics and essentially drawing arbitrary lines in sand where, the people who lived through those events didn't have really that sort of perception of the times that they were living in. So it's all very strange and basically cyclical argumenting for the sake of having an argument and having discussion, I guess, keeping yourself in a job because you kind of need to keep writing. Historians kind of need to keep producing sort of text to make sure they keep a job, basically. So yeah, today we're going to be looking at where does the term the Dark Ages come from. So if you're not aware, there's a guy called Petrarch, and this is Petrarch here, and he is kind of to blame for why we have the term Dark Ages. We'll be going into that in a bit. Like the sonnet? Yeah, Petrarch sonnets. Yes, so Petrarch was a poet. We'll get into that. Don't worry. And we'll be talking about why is it a contentious term. And also, I do have a little sub-point about what is historiography. So if you're not aware, historiography is essentially the study of making history or discussing history. So I figured I'd put that in the slide because just in case people aren't aware what historiography is. Any questions so far? Any questions at all? I'll just use this time to take a sip. Or is everyone all good? Will there be a quiz on this? No, there won't be a quiz. Who's the guy on the right? He is Petrarch. He is an Italian, or was, I should say. He is an Italian, I guess he was a poet, and scholar. I think his name was it Francesco Petrarca or something like that. We'll get to it in a sec. But yeah. How do historians fight over a dispute? Through written word. Is the term Dark Ages coined by a specific historian? Yes, actually. This guy right here, Petrarch. Was he Renaissance and medieval? So he is actually, well, we'll get to that in a sec, but he is actually considered the father of the Renaissance. So, yeah. Did he die? Well, he lived like 600 years ago, so it'd be a bit unusual if he was still alive. What did you miss? Not much. We've just started. A Petrarch of the Renaissance. But yes, if there's no other connections. Oh yeah, the alerts are still showing up. Yeah, I'll hide them. Thank you everyone for following, and thank you everyone for subscribing. I'll go over them at the end. But where is it? In the OBS. There it is. Okay. I'll just hide them for now. I do appreciate everyone for following, but yeah, just for the sake of not obscuring the slides during the sort of lecture period, I just want to make it nice and easy to follow. Okay. Was he colorblind or did he have a terrible sense in fashion? No. He had drip. He had European drip. What are you talking about? You're just looking at history of present values. That's called presentism. You're not supposed to do that. I think it's helpful to think of the Renaissance as more of a movement than a period. Yes, it is. So yes, we will move on to the next slide. So, what or where does the term come from? So, as we just mentioned, it comes from an old guy, an old mate, Petrarch, also known as Francesco di Petrarco. I think I butchered the Italian. I apologize. I will be butchering pronunciations, don't worry. I apologize. So he coined the term. He lived from 1304 to 1374. He was just before what people would consider the start of the Renaissance movement, or Renaissance period, I guess, if you want to call it that. In Italy, he is known as Petrarch. Yes, I imagine the Italian pronunciations will be much different. So a little bit about him. He was a scholar and poet of the early Italian Renaissance period. He was one of the earliest humanists, if not one of the first humanists. And he argued that God had given humans their vast intellectual and creative potential to be used to their fullest. So if you're not aware, sort of like prior to this sort of understanding of the relationship between humanity and God at that point was a bit more sort of humans were essentially subservient to God, whereas in the Renaissance era you have people essentially standing up on their own for the first time and thinking for themselves as in the image of God, and so worthy of living, life to the fullest, and not being so sort of not spending all your time kneeling in church, essentially, right? But still having the focus of a religious life, because Christianity was still an important aspect of medieval life, and would be for, well, I mean, it's technically still kind of nowadays, but not to the extent that it used to be. But yes, if you don't know about him, he was actually studying to be a lawyer. But his early passion was actually learning or reading Roman and Greek texts that had survived through the act of copying, or a copying of manuscripts, or basically the act of sort of writing down the old texts, and he was obsessed with them, and so he actually he's considered the first tourist because he loved to travel and he loved to go visit different parts of Europe, mainly around Italy, and he focused specifically on areas where he had access to historical manuscripts. And so one of the things that he is most famous for is that he rediscovered Cicero's or Cicero's, and amongst other Roman writers' letters, which helped reconnect 14th century life with the Roman past. And so you have during this time period, there were still resources there were still extant resources. It wasn't just that there was no knowledge of the Roman past. Obviously, he was reading Roman and Greek texts prior to finding this. It's not like he found the Rosetta Stone, for example, that helped kickstart, our knowledge of Egyptian history, for example, or the knowledge of the Egyptian language, I should say. He helped he helped uncover these sort of texts. I know Cicero is correct, but it sounds wrong. Yeah, well, that's Latin. Did he get paid? I have no idea. Probably did. Well, he did publish his works, including one being a letter that he wrote to Cicero himself, even though Cicero, I think, at that point had been dead for about 1400 years, something about that. But yes, also another thing that he helped with his discovery of these Roman writers is it helped with the preservation of Latin prose, and also acting as a resource for instruction on how to write and read Latin and pronunciations and all that jazz. Because unfortunately, as time drifts on, our sort of understanding of Latin is there's a gap in knowledge, and so there was a decline in Latin knowledge and pronunciation and prose, and people weren't using Latin as much because other languages essentially took over in terms of importance. Do the same thing as the last lecture. If you have any questions, please highlight your message. Oh yeah, that is a good point. Thank you for reminding me. So yeah, he's quite famous for recording all these sort of, or sharing the sort of knowledge of the Roman past, and in essence, I should say, also the Greek past, because Romans and Greeks intertwined. But yeah, I think that's all for this slide. Was there a drop in history-keeping quality between Roman times and the 14th century? We will get to, not necessarily that specific topic, but we will get to writing and sort of recording history in the future. I just realized, do I have any BGM? Oh, I don't. I'm just raw dogging it. Okay, I apologize. I'm raw dogging the audio at the moment. I should have maybe got my BGM. I'm doing what now? Apologies, I used the term wrong, I think. Should I move over to the other scene? It shouldn't be too hard if I do that, because I think I have it over here. I can't remember if I did the presentation here on the other scene last time. I think I was in this scene, wasn't I? Any other notable writers other than Cicero? I believe he also discovered works by Seneca. That's the one off the top of my head that I remember, but I think he also found some other works. He actually just found them, I believe, in a monastery. I believe they were stored in a monastery, and he just so happened to find them. Sorry. I did have BGM for the last lecture. I apologize. I mean, we can just keep going. It's probably not that bad. So yeah, any other questions for Petrarch? Was there any other notable bias in his record of history? Oh yeah, he is 100% biased. As you can probably tell, he is, and we will get to this in a future slide. He loved Roman and Greek classical history, and decried the times in which he lived in, and also the times in the past. We'll get to it in a sec, though. He's a classic Romaboo? Yeah. Oh god, I don't remember which faction he belonged to. If he did fall under any faction in particular, I apologize. So how did he discover letters? Just found them in the attic? Yeah, essentially. He I believe he uncovered them at a monastery. In, I want to say Verona, which is in northern Italy. I'm pretty sure it was in Verona where he found the sort of historical text. Did Petrarch write any other major literature pieces? Oh, he's probably most famous for his poetry, outside of his historical sort of discoveries. I think he's most famous for poetry, and so he has a lasting legacy as a part of the Renaissance, and also talking about, well, you know, the past and the present. Well, his contemporary time. So I don't know if he. I can't remember what his. I'd have to look it up. I don't have the titles of all his works available to me at the moment, but yeah. No, I'm not going to answer some of these. Okay, some of these questions are a little bit silly, so I will move on if we don't have anything. Any particular themes? Oh gosh, I think he had one of his focus points was it was like a romance, if I'm not mistaken. I don't remember the name of the woman, but like a recurring theme of his poetry was about him falling in love with a woman who he couldn't marry, or something to that effect. I'd have to do some research. I didn't do too much into his actual like sort of other written works. I sort of focused on the topic at hand. But yeah, if we can move on, I do actually have a quote from, or quotes from Petrarch's letter to Cicero. If you would like to read it, I will read it out loud. Oh, was it Dante who did that? Maybe it was. I might be getting my Renaissance writers mixed up. But yeah, so to give an example of Petrarch's sort of mentality or beliefs about his own time period compared to the past, compared to the classical past, here is his letter that he wrote to Cicero, some parts of it, and it goes as following. Thy letters sought long and earnestly, and found where I least thought to find them, and I have read with greatest eagerness. I have listened to thee, Marcus Tullius, that's Cicero's first name, as thou didst talk of many matters, as thou didst lament many ills, as thou didst throw upon many subjects the transforming light of thine intelligence, and I, who had long known what sort of guide thou hadst been to others, have at last understood what kind of man thou wert to thyself. The fame of thy deeds is widespread, and thy name is great and fills the ears of men, but the studious are very few in number. This is him talking about his present day. Whether the cause lie in the sternness of the times, or in the dullness and sluggishness of men's minds, or what I rather think, in the greed for gain which drives the thoughts of men towards their ends. So, I didn't exactly make it super clear, but essentially the first part is him talking to Cicero about how great and wonderful Cicero was, and then the second part is him talking about his own time period in which he laments the fact that life just isn't as grand or as grandiose or excellent as the classical word had been. He was down bad. His love was for a girl named Laura. That was it, yes, thank you. Essentially, kids these days are energy? Yeah. People have been writing about kids these days essentially throughout all of history. It's a common occurring sort of phenomena throughout all of history that people lament their current times in comparison to the past. He was born in the wrong generation? Yeah, kinda. Is the Aristotle one fake? Oh gosh, I think I know what you're specifically referring to, but I would have to look up what you're referring to. But yeah, that's an example of Petrarch's sort of, I don't know, feelings towards the past and his contemporary times, essentially. How was he received in his time? So he was considered quite an influential person in the Renaissance, because this was a time period in which people sort of reevaluated their connection with God and their relationship with God and their spirituality, as well as their own moral code. And so Petrarch's discoveries were obviously very influential, and he was quite, I believe, he was a bit of a celebrity in 14th century Europe because of his sort of publications of works, as well as, helping to reestablish people's connections with the classical period. Not that there wasn't a connection already, but he helped further develop that connection. But yeah, okay, moving on. So, it's important to understand Petrarch's world in when he talks about lamenting the current times that he lives in. So it's important to provide some context as to what that time period was. So as you're aware, Petrarch lived from sort of early 1300s to, I think, 1374, I think was his lifespan. So he's obviously talking about mostly the 14th century. And most of his life was spent in Italy. So Italy was dominated by, then, the fragmented republics, duchies. I just realized I put republics twice. One sec. Ooh. Kingdoms. That was meant to be kingdoms. Apologies. Editing on the fly. Yes, Venice was spotted. There's my lovely favorite Venice. And so he is living in a time that Italy is essentially split up between various different polities, and there's no sense of unity or sort of, common Italian sort of shared heritage. And so people are very sort of like fragmented and split up, and there's no sort of like camaraderie between your fellow Italians. Everyone was sort of competing on their own and, sort of driven by your own sort of sense of morals or goals or gains. And so as a result, you have many of the cities being controlled by corrupt, greedy, tyrannical sort of leaders, cities, and also, the kingdoms and rulers. And so he's lamenting the sort of moral compass of these people who were in power at the time. Also, at the same time, you also have, because there was no sort of unified, there was no sort of unified country. You actually have the countryside being rather unsafe, because there's no sort of one polity dominating the region. So you have people controlling and protecting their own regions, and so the lands in between the cities and the you have kind of just like, right, it's full of banditry and it's not very safe. So you actually had to hire guards at the time to travel from city to city, essentially. As a law student, he also decried the legal system at the time. He was not a fan of that, which is actually why he kind of drops out. He's kind of like a legal school dropout, essentially, to focus on his own passions, which was classical literature. Obviously, one thing that he wasn't a fan of was the use of Latin was in decline. And so, he being a classicist, essentially, was not happy that, people weren't in touch with classical history and, speaking and writing Latin, for example. He is essentially, yes, what we would call nowadays, we would call like a Romaboo. He was very much like, longing for the days of yore, essentially. And so this is a time period because of the fracturing, commerce and trade within the Italian peninsula was reduced. That's not to say that trade overall in 14th century Italy was like on a decline or anything. It was actually quite flourishing. It's just trade between cities wasn't it wasn't to the sort of levels that the Roman Empire and the Roman Republic would have had. You had republics like Venice. You had oh god, what am I thinking? You had Ragusa. You had I think it's Amalfi. You had Pisa. You had all these different republics in Italy and around the Mediterranean that were helping propagate trade thanks to the Byzantine Empire. But yes, he's still kind of lamenting the sort of state that the world was in. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to click on that. But yeah, another thing that he was not a fan of, he didn't really like the Pope. But that's kind of like a sort of... The Renaissance in general kind of was at odds a little bit with the Pope. And as well as the state of the Catholic Church, there was sort of accusations of corruption. But again, when you are lauding Roman history and being dissatisfied with your modern day because it's corrupt, and then you look back at the Roman history and corruption was rife everywhere, it's kind of like not necessarily hypocritical, but it's a bit, it's sort of rose-colored glasses, essentially, looking back on history, right? Milan was under the French boot for a while. That actually occurs in the 1500s, so that's a good 200 years later at this point. And yeah, so he viewed Italy as having lost many sort of the philosophical and artistic cultural achievements, essentially, that had been earned under the Roman Empire. He was a bit sort of sad about losing them, even though, well, it's a bit more complex than that, as history is wont to do. And any questions? I will scroll up because there were some people already asking questions. I always find it interesting that English speakers translate historical texts in a very Shakespearean-sounding way. I think that's just a product of their education, probably. It's probably just the product of the sort of education and sort of the influence that Shakespeare has on history and historical writing, essentially. Was this unity between the Italian states comparable to the German microstates and HGRE? Yeah. A little bit. Not exactly the same. Obviously, I think in Italy you do have moments in Italian history where they do unify, especially Petrarch was essentially 100 years too early, I think, because during the Renaissance you did have part of the reason that the Renaissance period was so prosperous for Italy was that there was a common peace that was forged by the head of the Duchy of Florence. I forget his name. It was Medici. I apologize. We talked about him in the what was it? The War of League of Cambrai lecture. We talked about that. But yes, there was more of a camaraderie and common sort of purpose and sort of fraternity amongst the Italians about 100 years later, which unfortunately Petrarch missed out on. What is my favorite Italian city-state? Probably Venice. Let's see if there's any other questions. How many estates of these were controlled by other powers, such as France? So you can probably see it in the graph, actually. So Sardinia and Sicily, both here at this time, were ruled by Aragon. Aragon is the, so if you imagine, this is the coastline of the Mediterranean. You get to sort of eastern Spain or eastern Iberia. Aragonese, the Kingdom of Aragon was basically like, essentially the eastern half of the Iberian Peninsula. So they ended up controlling Sardinia and Sicily. They actually, in the future, get control of Naples, quite briefly, because I think Naples gets inherited by Provence, and then Aragon gets it off the Provence, I think, is how it goes. I might be misremembering. Overall trade was pretty good thanks to the rise of mercantile republics and the Crusades. Yes. Again, so we're talking about sort of Petrarch's sort of understanding and perception of the world around him, not necessarily what was actually true when he's referring to his sort of lamentations of the world he lives in, right? This is how he is viewing the world, not necessarily what is actually happening, because we will get to that later in the thing. Yes, the Peace of Lodi, thank you very much. Yes, between Florence, Milan, Venice, and the Papal States. So essentially the major powers in northern Italy. What I'm hearing is that Venice was corrupt, greedy, tyrannical, and filled with bandits. Not necessarily just Venice. Many sort of areas in the Italian peninsula were sort of suffering from the same fate, so to speak. Whilst Venice was a republic technically, how close were they to a participatory democracy in the modern sense? So they weren't really. The Venetian Republic was essentially an oligarchy. And so power was held in the wealthy elites. The common people didn't really get a say in who was elected Doge being the leader of the Venetian Republic. And the election system was ridiculously complex in a way to try and maintain checks and balances. So there are elements of the Venetian Republic that might be familiar to modern democracies, in which you have sort of these checks and balances to try and make sure that the head of state doesn't become autocratic. But no, it wasn't necessarily like a democracy by any sense of the imagination, with people voting, like the common people weren't voting on their leaders. How would you compare Petrarch to someone like Desiderius Erasmus in terms of popularity? Oh god, you are right in that Erasmus has been referred to as the first celebrity. I wouldn't know, because it's kind of hard to sort of quantify that sort of... It's hard to quantify that sort of value of fame, right? It's kind of hard to sort of say, oh, one person was more famous than the other. Maybe nowadays, in sort of modern society, it's quite easy to do that because things have numerical values attached to them. But I think back then it would be a bit difficult to say who was more famous, right? What about the popes at this time? Did they drive their own agenda and align with political actors? Always have. The popes were always pushing for their own agendas and what they thought was best for the religion as a whole, right? Scrolling down, scrolling down, scrolling down. No. Okay. Who was the current pope at the time? Oh god. 1300s, so there was quite a few popes, if I'm not mistaken. I would have to go look that up. But I imagine there was quite a few popes. Isn't that the pope's job? I mean, the pope is meant to be like the head of the church and supposed to act as like the voice of God. And oftentimes they further their own agendas rather than, let's say, for the good of the entire Christian world, essentially. Italy wouldn't be unified properly until Garibaldi? Exactly, yes. A few anti-popes too as well. Yes. So in fact, a fun fact about Petrarch is that he actually got sent to study law in Avignon, which is where the anti-pope, I believe, was it the anti-pope? Or was it one of the pope's residences? Or papal residences. So he did have a connection to sort of the world of the papal state. Hence why he had opinions about the pope, for example. For example, I think Charlemagne had quite a bit of control over the pope in his time. Oh, okay, you mean in terms of how much autonomy the pope had over the medieval world? So at this time, you do have the pope being one of the most important figures in medieval history. So you do have, for example, the pope in Pope Innocent III, I think, is referred to as the most powerful pope of all time, if not maybe one of his successors. So it's around about that time in which the pope is considered one of the most influential and powerful men in all of Europe. But yeah, if there's no more questions, we can move on, because yes, we need to get back to Petrarch. So, as we just saw, sort of Petrarch's world that he lived in, it's important to understand the medieval attitudes of the past. So there were people, the classical world wasn't just ignored. People knew about the classical world, but it's important to realize that they were looking at their classical past through the lens of religion, as faith and religion was very, very important central, essentially, to medieval life. And so the conception of pre-Christian times were oftentimes seen as unenlightened, barbaric, because they were dominated by sort of paganism and polytheism, etc., etc., etc. And that was looked down upon because, people at that point had been sort of following Christianity for, at that point, 1,000 years. So, Christianity had become ingrained in society. And so you can see that, for example, of a painting by Tommaso Loretti. I've probably butchered the pronunciation. Who is actually a 16th century painter. This is actually in the Vatican, I believe. This painting here is actually in the Vatican. And as you can see, you have the sort of classical Greco-Roman statue collapsed on the floor, and you have the sort of immortalization of Jesus Christ. So you can kind of understand the sort of mentality that people had back then towards the classical world. And so I believe this is a quote from Petrarch, in which he says, "Amidst the errors there shone forth men of genius. No less keen were their eyes, although they were surrounded by darkness and dense gloom." So he's actually writing about from that passage, he's actually writing about the medieval world when talking about sort of, or having still some interest in the classical period. Because, as I mentioned previously, the medieval world still was connected to the classical past, albeit not as much as he would have liked because of the sort of influence and authority that the Christian world had. Is medieval correct or just a typo? That's a correct spelling. You can spell it multiple different ways. Any questions? Hopefully that was a clear point. I apologize. The last point might not have been too clear. Any questions? If not, we can move on. Does the erroneous belief that all Roman statues were purely white originate from the Renaissance? Ooh. I'm not sure, actually. I'm not sure, because I don't know how well preserved the statues would have been at the time during the Renaissance period, for example. Because if you're not aware, Roman statues were painted. I believe Greek statues were painted as well. But obviously through time, the paint sort of wears off. And so that's why we often associate sort of the statues with sort of like classical white marble, etc., because that's what they were made of underneath the sort of painting. Cicero died around 40 BC, so way before Christianity was the state religion. Yes. So I'm like, no, don't worry. There'll be a VOD on YouTube when I am done. Hopefully it won't take too long. I'll need to fix up my bibliography because I have my bibliography all done, but I just grabbed the sources as I listed them. I didn't actually have time to rearrange them in alphabetical order. I can show them on stream eventually when we get to the end, but yeah. Wasn't it part of the Renaissance an effort to Christianize paganism? In a sense, yes, but no. There was we'll get it to the next slide. In fact, I'll just move on to the next slide. But essentially, the Renaissance period, or movement rather, essentially tried to see its past, or it saw its Christian present as a continuity of the classical past, essentially. Which, there we go. Here we go. So what was new? Did I mention the Enlightenment? Oh, yeah. Okay, so a big thing about history, obviously, is... Sorry, I completely missed this point. Big point about history is often the very, very common use of a light and dark metaphor, or good versus evil. So that was oftentimes used to... act as like a moral compass, essentially, especially in the Christian period. And so it was often used as, the Christian world was seen as the light and the pagan past was seen as the dark. So what was new? So Petrarch essentially takes that metaphor and flips it on its head. So he essentially views the classical paganist past as the light, enlightened period in which sort of culture was at its peak, and associated the dark with the modern day times, or his modern day times, aka the medieval Christian world. And so he coins the term of essentially a dark age, referring to the specifically cultural and moralistic stagnation of Europe at the time. Wasn't Petrarch a monk? I don't remember if he had any sort of monastic career or anything like that. I apologize. And so yeah, the Renaissance essentially attempts to imbue the sort of the role of the Renaissance period was to imbue the contemporary ruling classes with the moral attitudes of the Antiquity era. So essentially revitalizing Roman morality and instilling it in their sort of medieval what's the word? medieval sort of not equivalents, but medieval sort of rulers. Milieu? Is that the word I'm looking at? I don't know. So yes, so there was the trivium, which is basically the old sort of terminology for humanities study. And that was essentially expanded on with the Studia Humanitatis, which is, I apologize, Latin is not my expertise. I probably butchered the pronunciation. But you can probably recognize Humanitatis as humanities, right? So essentially it was the establishment of a broader focus on the study of the humanities, studies of history, philosophy, literature, prose, oration, and so there was the focus on that, which was made possible through the recovery of Greek and Roman literature and philosophy, in part thanks to people like Petrarch, who helped discover or rediscover sort of works. And so Petrarch, in particular, basically splits history into two periods, one of which was the classical period of the Greco-Roman world, and the time of darkness, so a dark age, which he himself considered himself to be living in, which we will get to, I think, in the next slide. So this concept of periodization, where did Petrarch live? All over the place. He traveled a lot, so I don't remember where his specific home was. But this concept of periodization, of having a sort of antiquity or classical era, and then a dark age, and then a period of sort of a better age that they lived in, was expanded on in the 15th century by historians such as Leonardo Bruni, Bruni and Flavio Biondo. I apologize, Italian. Sorry, burp. Biondo. During the height of the Renaissance movements, and they came up with the concept of a modern better age, which they believed that they now lived in. Because, let's be honest, the Renaissance period was a bit self-righteous. As we will see, self-righteousness kind of is a reoccurring theme throughout history. And so, yes, that term, the Dark Ages, or rather the term for that middle age between the classical world and the better age that they lived in, was called the Middle Age. And so that's where the term Middle Ages comes from. It's where medieval comes from. Media Tempestas, or Medium Aeum? But yeah, you get the word medieval from Medium Aeum, I guess. Right? Yes? Yes. Sorry, I'm so indecisive about that because my Latin pronunciation is absolutely horrible. Oh yeah, Aewum. Sorry, yes. Yeah, it's been so long I completely forgot the these are w sounds. Aewum. Sorry. Thank you. Thank you very much. But yeah, any questions about this sort of perception of sort of medieval history in comparison to ancient history? I'll take a bite of my biscuit whilst I... take a break. Any questions? Nope. Okay, moving on. Oh, there we go. How was this received? That the more Christian period was dark, according to him. So you have to remember that the Renaissance era or period, or movement rather, was essentially like it was a stretch of like 100 to 200 sort of years of thinking at the time, and so you have these writers who are building off the works of Petrarch and the understanding of Petrarch, and so this becomes like especially in Italy, a common conception of the past, in that the past was seen as barbaric and dark and, lacking in the moral fiber of the past, and that, we were now making a sort of a movement towards a brighter future, essentially. So they were fine reconciling with the past as, you know, primitive or barbaric, essentially. Didn't the Pope get mad at Petrarch for glorifying pagan times? Yes. Yes, I think so. But again, you have to remember that the classical period was still known about. Like, it wasn't sort of like completely unknown until Petrarch discovered it. People still had knowledge of the past. They just associated it with, you know, lacking in the Christian sort of morality, so to speak. Just look at the art. Yeah, so you have an example of sort of like medieval life here in comparison to sort of classical period here. You know, pretty sort of clear sort of messaging. I believe this is I can't remember what this was called. I think it was called Petrarch's Virgil, I think is the name of this artwork. I believe this is meant to be Petrarch. I think this is meant to be wisdom, or the concept of wisdom, and then I believe this is meant to be Virgil. I think that's the painting. Anyway, so here is a quote from Petrarch himself. So if one of his most famous works was actually about Scipius Africanus, called Africa. And so he was writing about the life of Scipius, essentially. And so he actually concludes his biography of Scipius Africanus with the following. He says, "My fate is to live amongst varied and confusing storms, but for you, perhaps, if as I hope and wish you will live long after me, there will follow a better age. This sleep of forgetfulness will not last forever. When the darkness has been dispersed, our descendants can come again in the former pure radiance." So it's pretty clear messaging on Petrarch's behalf of him talking about the world in which he lived in, lacking in the sort of, you know, he literally calls classical antiquity a time of radiance, and that his hope is for future generations to rekindle that sort of radiance. Essentially, a little bit like Dark Souls. Rekindling the flame that once was, rekindling the greatness, instead of living in the dark. Did he like Africanus? Yeah, he definitely did. He was a big fan of Scipio Africanus. But yeah, any questions? It's just a quote about Petrarch. Sort of his sort of concept of his life around him. What was their view of the Eastern Roman Empire since it was still around? Exactly. You're noticing a distinct lack of focus on the Eastern Roman Empire or the Byzantine Empire. That is intentional. Why is the text named Africa? Because it was named after Scipio Africanus. The whole continent of Africa is named after Scipio Africanus. We will get to the Eastern Roman Empire in a bit. In fact, actually, the next slide even touches on it. So I do need a little bit of audience participation, because the next slide, I'm going to ask you guys a question about the following graph. So this graph outlines the sort of, or displays the European output of manuscripts from 500 to 1500 AD. So as you can probably see, the early sort of 5 centuries, you have very little manuscripts being produced. And then starting in about the 12th century, you do get the kickstart of production of manuscripts. So this is specifically referring to religious manuscripts. So this is Christian manuscripts being produced. This is not actually anything to do with antiquity. And so it's actually the number of copies in the millions. And most importantly, you have at the bottom, without southeastern Europe, which includes the Byzantine realm and Russia. So what does this graph tell you guys about medieval intellectualism? The invention of a printing press? Exactly. Literacy plus language? It's also indicative of population gain. You also have issues of literacy. So again, literacy and sort of knowledge of reading and writing is still something that is very, very restricted to the wealthy elites. We will actually touch on that a bit later. But yes, so the sort of the production of manuscripts it did expand, but specifically during the time of Petrarch, which is the 14th century, you have Petrarch decrying that people aren't writing anything. But if you look at this graph, during the 14th century, they're actually supposedly in Western Europe producing almost 3 million copies of works. So it kind of shows that Petrarch was a little bit biased with his sort of perception of the world around him. So he was wrong? Not necessarily. His focus was entirely on sort of the connection to the Antiquity era. He was a Romaboo, essentially. And so you do have manuscripts being produced. It's just, for a Christian world, what would the Christian world need to read and write about? They wrote about Christian topics, Christian works. So you have, essentially, a Romaboo who's decrying, why aren't they writing about Rome? Well, it's because people didn't need to know about Rome. They needed to learn about the Bible. They needed to know Christian literature. And so, even in the 13th century, which is the century prior to Petrarch, they still produced almost 2 million manuscripts in the century previously, right? So, this is sort of helping to sort of understand, and this is excluding, the Byzantine era realm, it's excluding Russia. This is purely just mostly Western Northern Europe, right? With a focus on theology, exactly. Is there any significant change in materials used? Nope. I don't think so. So you have to bear in mind that these manuscripts were produced by hand. For the most part, produced by hand, with members of the church, members of the clergy, writing out copies by hand. Is this on vellum? Oh gosh. I don't know if I can tell you exactly. Paper tech was mostly unevolved until modern times. I believe so. I would have to double check all these. But yeah, so you would have these members of the clergy were essentially just copying over and over and over manuscripts, sort of any sort of works that they had that needed to be mass produced, except they weren't mass produced because it was all by hand. So another thing that this graph can show you is the output of the clergy class in terms of literature and sort of theological sort of manuscripts. Are there any examples of famous theological manuscripts? So yes, there was one that I remember reading about that I think is included in this, but I would have to look it up, and I don't have the name of it at the moment. I apologize. I think the author was, I'm going to butcher the pronunciation, Migne? Migne. Migne, I think is the the author's name. I can't remember what his work was, but that was the author. I believe his work was quite widely pronounced throughout Europe because it was very sort of accessible. I think it was accessible because people weren't as literate back then. It was a more accessible, easily produced sort of work that people could get to help, with their faith essentially. Were there more private companies? No, so manuscripts were primarily a clergy, and like bookkeeping and book writing was primarily a clerical duty. There definitely would have been, people producing their own works in a non-religious format, or even in religious formats, but because, the people had to write for the times that they lived in, and to write for the times that they live in, you need to make sure that you're necessarily following the belief systems of the world around you, right? Otherwise, you would be leveled heretic or even worse. I'm not sure how to explain this, but maybe some form of overall increase in stability, which meant more people could dedicate time to writing. Yeah, but it also shows an expansion of the clergy as well. For example, you have the increase of the power of the church, you have the increase in the number of members of the clergy who are being educated in the world of reading and writing. Oh, don't worry about reading late. Thank you. And so, the people that were writing these were oftentimes common people who had been educated in the ways of the church, who were then spending their time writing. Because the church was one of the ways that people could actually educate themselves. Okay, right. Any other questions before we move on? Sorry. Were any big cases of original text being changed in the copy process? Yes. Yeah, so a big issue with our... oh, one sec. Sorry, my roomie was... Oh, I didn't close the door. He was asking if I wanted a cup of tea, because I'd finished my cup of tea already. One sec. What does the graph tell me? It says the output of manuscripts went up. I kind of elaborated on it in a little bit. Is there any correlation between the Black Death and the new focus on getting people educated? Ooh. I'm not sure. I'm not sure at all, actually. It'd be hard to say. Because, the Black Death wasn't exactly the first pandemic that people throughout history have faced, and I don't know if there was a trend of any surge in education after those. Did the sack of Constantinople influence the rate of manuscript making? 1204? No. So... The Black Death came through trade over the Silk Road. With trade comes education, so you could argue that way. I see your point, but there's a little bit of a reach, because not necessarily. You do get aspects of sort of education spreading through trade. Obviously, the interaction between the Muslim world and the Christian world helped propagate some knowledge, but a lot of that knowledge actually came through the Byzantine world, as opposed to the Muslim world. It's not that direct, yeah. What was I going to say? So yeah, what this graph tells me is that the power of the church became increasingly the power and the influence of the church became increasingly important to medieval life. And so you have people reading, or the need to read, religious manuscripts, but that doesn't necessarily mean that people weren't reading classical periods as well. Classical manuscripts as well. So, that sort of interpretation of Petrarch's sort of beliefs in the world. Anyway, okay, moving on. Education is a vague term. It is. Oh, yeah, someone asked about, where was it? Where is it? What about Koboda? Didn't it become a university city in the Islamic world in the 8th century? There must have been significant amounts of writings produced by them. Oh, yeah, so this graph completely ignores that. This graph is European output, not necessarily Islamic. Even though, yes, Koboda is in southern Spain, right? No, this is focusing on the Christian world only. What was the other question that I saw that I did kind of touch on? If I can find it. Sorry, it was a good question. Oh yes, about the accuracy of works being copied. Yeah, that was always a concern, and is a concern in history that we have to unfortunately just reconcile or deal with. Is that the texts that we have nowadays that survived have gone through the hands of countless different monks, clerics, writers, who have all written down, the story over and over and over again. And so what we have today has probably passed through maybe hundreds of hands, right? And who the heck knows if any single one of them, played the game of what we call now telephone, and they changed something. We have no way of, unless we have multiple examples of these works that we compare and contrast to, we don't necessarily know if we can actually rely on these works, right? So that is always something that you have to take with a grain of salt when looking at historical sources, is that they have gone through they have passed through countless hands to get to us. And so we have to try and reconcile with the fact that, what we are using as historical evidence might not necessarily be true. It might be, some 13th century cleric wrote a little bit of fan fiction about something, and now we understand that as history. But, you kind of just have to deal with the cards that you've been dealt, right? And that's just an issue of history. Okay, moving on. Sorry, I'm actually going to hydrate because I can feel my voice dying. So, propagation of the concept of darkness and decline. So how does it go from Petrarch's concept of a dark age that he lived in to modern day? Well, we're going to explore that a little bit. Sorry. Took a bite of biscuit. Apologies. Oh, one sec. Sorry, Rumi was just handing a cup of tea. So yeah. What is the next, probably most influential event on the Christian world? The Reformation. Sorry, my voice is dying. Oh no. So the Reformation supported the view of the Renaissance humanists, but added on the addition of having an anti-Catholic perspective. Sorry, I need to hydrate. No, my voice is dying. No, this is awful. So as you can see, there's Old Mate nailing his theses to the church door as an image. I just wanted to put him in the slide. I didn't have any. He doesn't actually have any specific interaction with the Dark Age himself. It's just it fits. So yeah, we have the Reformation taking Petrarch's ideas about the previous history being a dark age and adapting it for their own political agenda. So they view the Antiquity era or the classical era as bearing the witness to the beginnings of Christianity before it was corrupted by the Catholic Church. And so they take this concept of corruption and make it synonymous with the Middle Ages or the medieval period. And in essence, they are ascribing religious morality to history. And so it's talking about not necessarily the Dark Ages being full of sort of violence and or a collapse in society, but rather a decline in morals and culture. And so this sort of mentality is then taken by your sort of the Reformation theologians and sort of politicians, because obviously you get at this time very contentious history between the Protestants and the Catholics. And so, you know, you have this sort of judgment on the past in less than favorable ways because of modern or contemporary issues that they were facing, because they wanted to, you know, get one up on the Catholic Church. And so, of course, the Catholic Church doesn't exactly take that lying down. Also, before I move on, any questions? Yes, Martin Luther nailing his memes on the door of a church. It's valid to assume that the church, religion, and state politics became even closer in the Dark Ages, more so than the Roman times. Well, it's not the Dark Ages, it's medieval period. But yes, the church was intertwined with politics. And, you know, the political world was, you know, the Protestant Reformation was a response to the intertwining of church and state, in a sense. Religion is the very concept that the term meme was invented for. Yeah, memetics. Yeah, if there's no question. Cleo blaming Protestants for the propagation of the Dark Ages. No. Don't worry. It doesn't stop here. But it is how people took Petrarch's concepts and took them further and added to them and changed them and adapted them to their own sort of, you know, propaganda or political leanings, essentially, right? So, of course, you know, there's the concept of darkness and decline being thrown about at the time. Sorry, I keep clicking on the slides like an idiot. Dark Ages sounds metal. Yeah, that's the problem. It sounds really cool. And that's the problem with pop culture, is that Dark Ages sounds cool. Anyway, getting back to history, not pop culture. So, the Catholics strike back with this smug son of a gun. He's called Caesar Baronius, or Cardinal Kaiser Baronius. I don't know if the pronunciation's probably absolutely butts. I think he's an Italian. So, obviously the Catholics, or the Catholic Church, doesn't really like the fact that they are being associated with decline, darkness, loss of morality and culture. So they actually, they take their own sort of, their own spin on history, essentially. And so they depict the medieval period as a period of social and religious harmony. Again, adapting this history to contemporary issues, right? We see that even nowadays, right? So during the height of the 16th and 17th centuries, you have the religious conflicts, you have the 30 Years' War, you have these widespread issues gripping the European continent, which were exceptionally violent. And so the Catholic Church uses the image of the medieval period as a time of relative harmony and social harmony, religious harmony, political harmony in medieval Europe. And they use that to essentially propagate sort of the idea that the medieval period wasn't actually that bad compared to what it is like nowadays because of those darn Protestants. And so he actually does still use the term Dark Ages. I think it's not necessarily Dark Ages. It's not, I think the exact pronunciation, or not pronunciation, it's not the exact translation of Dark Age, but it's Saeculum Obscurum. And it's that specific phrase that gets picked up in the 17th century, so the 100 years following his life, which he uses to refer to as the time between the 9th and 10th century, which I believe is the time of Charlemagne to, I forget which pope it is, but there was a pope in the 10th century. Was it the 11th century? It might be the 10th to the 11th century. But he's talking essentially about there was like a mini dark age, essentially, that he refers to in European history, in which, you know, the church is essentially doesn't have the same influence that it does nowadays, essentially. And so he's using that to refer to it as like, hey, European history was dark because the Catholic Church wasn't doing its cool Catholic Church things, essentially, right? You mean the Great Schism? No. I'd have to double check my notes, which I don't have open at the moment because I'm kind of just, oh, what is this? Okay, nothing to worry about. Yeah, so hopefully that makes sense. Not sure. Any questions? Any questions? But yeah, he gets that his term of Dark Age essentially continues to help the propagation of a Dark Age concept that is used heavily in the Enlightenment period. No? Anyone? Anyone at all? I'll give you guys a second. Did Berenius have any connection to Petrarch? I don't think so, because you're bearing in mind there's like 230 years, I think, between their times of their birth, I think. I think Petrarch was, what, 1304? And Berenius was 1538. So, you know, you have a pretty significant time separating them two. But it is important to realize that, you know, the works of Petrarch were essentially like the foundations for the concept of what a Dark Age was, that then got picked up by different sort of factions and peoples throughout history and changed to twist to their own changed to suit their own sort of definitions of and interpretations of history, essentially. So in essence, whatever Dark Age people perceived they were in was only a projection of their own powerlessness. The idea of a Dark Age stuck because of how empowering it is in its ability to grant victimhood. I wouldn't go that far. No, I wouldn't go that far. So it's essentially just like a, you know, the concept of a Dark Age historically was people talking about, oh, the times that we are in or the times that we were in were bad because of X, Y, Z. So for Petrarch, it was because people weren't as connected to their classical antiquity past. For the Reformation, it was because of the corruption of the Catholic Church. For Baronius, it was for a specific other issue, which it should have written down. I really should have written down. I might just go find it real quick. Dark Age. It refers to the period between the end of the Carolingian Empire in 888 and the first inklings of the Gregorian reform under Pope Clement II in 1046. There you go. There you go. That was what I was quoting. So essentially, he's talking about the reforms of the Catholic Church in the 11th century as the end of the Dark Age because the Catholic Church has been reformed, right? It's an exaggeration of bad stuff that wasn't that bad, essentially. Did Baronius reference Petrarch? No, so Baronius is talking about a Dark Age in contrast to the Reformists and the Protestants. It is very much a response to the ideology that was being, or the concepts that were being presented by the Reformists, essentially. It is a response. It's not necessarily like, it's not him saying, oh, there was no such thing as a Dark Age. It's him saying, oh, no, there was a Dark Age, but it was because the Catholic Church wasn't in power and, you know, it hadn't reformed in 1046, essentially. So it's all people just adapting the terminology of a Dark Age occurring to suit their own ideological purposes, essentially. You don't see him reading much of Petrarch's works. I'm not sure. I'm not sure how much he read of it. But, you know, it's just the reoccurring theme of a Dark Age being used throughout history. Okay. So, we move on to, as aforementioned, Enlightenment and, to a lesser extent, Romanticism. Boop. So, we've got old mate Gibbon here, who you may know. But yes, we have the Enlightenment, or looking down on the past. So, the Enlightenment, if you're not aware, was the 18th century movement, in which it took the approach from the Renaissance of humanism, but applied it to purely secular thought. So, whereas the Renaissance framed humanity's actions and activity as reflections of God's greatness, this was an age of reason rather than an age of faith. You have people sort of abandoning their Christian sort of idealization of how to act and simply acting as humans rather than, you know, and individuals rather than members of a faith, so to speak. An era of logic, yes. Logic and reason, etc., etc., etc. So yes, you have a concept of, just like the Renaissance was looking down upon the past, and even its sort of present in the case of Petrarch, but obviously later Renaissance historians such as Biondo and Bruni talking about living in better times. You now have, again, a repeat of history in which the Enlightenment writers viewed themselves as living in enlightened times, and hence the Enlightenment, and that the past was full of, it was essentially an entire period of social regress, dominated because of, or a period of social regress because it was dominated by religion. And so the light versus darkness metaphor that was used in the past for religious purposes was now repurposed entirely to include a anti-religious and anti-clerical spin. Sartre? Yes, Jets, yes. And so this is where we get our modern perception of what calls a dark age. The Dark Age, essentially. Or why the medieval period is viewed as a dark age. Because of the Enlightenment being so sort of, the propagation of Enlightenment authors throughout 18th century history, and then even the Romanticism era didn't really do much to help sort of fix the sort of PR, essentially, or the common perception of what the medieval world was like. And so you have this sort of reputation that has built up over time, in which medieval history is associated with social regress, religious corruption, and, you know, people are dumb and they're fighting each other all the time. And, you know, nowadays we are enlightened individuals, not bound by a creed or a religious view. It's not necessarily anti-theist. No, it's, religion was seen as antithetical to reason. So it was a little bit, right? And so as a result, you get to the modern period in which people are associating medieval history with not only Dark Ages, but also, well, they were associating the medieval period with barbarism, with violence, with stupidity, with social aggression, all these things that we don't have nowadays because, these people are looking down on the past based on their present living standards. It's like, oh, we live in such enlightened times, we are so wonderful and amazing, and the past was full of primitive, violent people who didn't know better because they lived in a dark age, essentially. And so, yeah, that's what we get to. And then here's the kicker. So why do we then associate the medieval era as the Dark Ages? You're never going to believe it, guys. Do you want to know whose fault it is? Do you want to know whose fault it is that modern culture refers to, or pop culture nowadays still refers to medieval history as the Dark Ages? It's the British fault. Unfortunately, so the concept of British historians taking their sort of understanding of medieval history through the Enlightenment and, of course, adapting it to sort of suit their own biases. So, British historians are responsible essentially for the modern conflation of British Dark Ages with the entirety of medieval history. You may have remembered that we talked about at the start, I'll go back to the slide, we talked about how the British Dark Ages refers specifically to the period of Saxon invasion up until the time of pre-Norman conquest. Yep, guess what? British historians essentially managed to conflate all of medieval history with that sort of era of history, with their own British history, dealing specifically with the invasion of the Saxon invasions, because it was a time of obviously great political instabilities, conflicts. I think one of the famous quotes from Buckle is, oh god, what's his name? Thomas Henry Buckle? Let me go get my reference list. Buckle. I think he's called Thomas Henry Buckle. Where is his name? He's in my list somewhere. Oh no, Henry Thomas Buckle. Sorry, not Thomas Henry Buckle. He's considered the father of history, by the way. Especially in British history. And so, like, one of his quotes about British history is that there were many kings, but there weren't many kingdoms. So it's a time of, political upheaval during in British history, and there's lots of different people upstarting and trying to, call themselves ruler, but, there was no sort of central power or unified force that we have today, because, he's writing in the 1800s, so, he's living in the height of the English Empire, blah, 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 blah. And so, yeah, he, along with his peers, essentially talk about, when they talk about the Dark Ages, they conflate religion, again, just like the Enlightenment writers did. And so they're, conflating the fact that during these Dark Ages, because the clergy and the church was so influential and, in his words, supreme, people were rightly in an era called the Dark Ages because they weren't thinking for themselves. They were bound to the sort of ideology and theology of the Catholic Church. And so, obviously, with the British Empire comes the spread of British ideas and knowledge throughout the world, which helped further associate, or rather, unfortunately, didn't help, hindered the association that medieval period would become known as the Dark Ages. Ta-da! So, okay, that's basically... How long are we in? Okay, we're at 2 hours already, jeez. Sorry, that's been an hour and a half. I didn't think it would take that long to get to this point. We're only on slide 20. The second half is a little bit shorter, but it's more... because we're about halfway. But yeah, I've introduced the concept of the Dark Ages and where it comes from and how it gets to modern day. Up next, we will be getting to why is the Dark Ages now considered problematic? Or rather, why is it a term that we no longer use? So yeah, if you have any questions, please let me know, because this is kind of a good point to ask questions about anything that's happened so far. You can still use the term, so historians don't use it anymore. You love long lectures? Well, I do have plans to stream today, because if you're not aware, for VOD watchers on YouTube, today's stream is actually on Bastille Day, so I do have something planned to sort of mark Bastille Day. I'll try and only answer the serious questions. I don't know if he was a fan of jazz. What about French historians and the thought of the age? So yeah, well, I mean, when I'm talking about the propagation of Dark Ages, like, you know, you have, like, the British historians were very influential throughout history. And, like, their works were seen as, like, you know, seminal sort of pieces about the truth of history. And so when they're writing about how the Dark Ages are, you know, these unenlightened times because they were dominated by the Catholic Church, they, you know, doesn't help. This is a Saxon tangent. I'm curious if you're aware of the recent scholarship indicating there were likely more Foederati Saxons rebelling and overthrowing or culturally assimilating their sovereigns in the post-Roman order than invaders. I mean, that would make sense. I'm not aware of any sort of modern Saxon scholarship. That's not something I've really looked into myself too much, but there is sort of, like, you know, that sort of concept of invasion versus assimilation is common. It's a common sort of occurrence throughout history, right? You have it happening in Ireland, for example, with the Norse and then the Normans, right? Which we talked about last history lecture. Was it all the British, or did other major European countries also get in on the Dark Ages things? So it's not necessarily like the British as a whole. It's more just like British historians were very influential throughout history. There were other historians that did also propagate the concept of a Dark Age, a medieval Dark Age occurring. It's just that European writers were, rather English writers or British writers were very sort of influential. With much of what was valued about Roman antiquity being derivative of ancient Greece, was there any dramatic difference in one being valued over the other during the Dark Ages? No, so they kind of go hand in hand. So Greco-Roman sort of ideals are kind of, at least in history, they are kind of linked, intertwined, because of how much the Roman sort of systems and beliefs and all that jazz, right? They kind of relied on the Greco world, or the Greek world, I should say. Because the Romans were very adaptive, right? And they adapted the Greek world to their own benefits and incorporated Greek theology, Greek philosophy, Greek everything into their own sort of system and beliefs, etc., etc., etc. As, you know, evident by the Romans incorporating the Greek gods into their own religious system, for example. Didn't the Romans also see the Greek as lesser, ironically? So culturally, they looked. It's kind of weird. So you have the Greeks being looked down upon during their conflict, but Greek culture and, like, sorry, I'm not sure I'm saying this properly. So they were kind of looked down upon during the conquests, right? But there was a lot of admiration for Greek culture, Greek learning, Greek education, Greek philosophy, etc., etc., etc. So that, you know, they had educated, smart Greeks being brought over to Rome as educators for the wealthy elite, essentially. And Greek culture and Greek sort of artistry, etc., all had an influence on the Roman world, right? You had the Roman world adapting to Greek sort of fashions in, you know, both clothing and artwork, etc., etc. Hopefully that makes sense. To specify the cause for the re-evaluation, essentially there is a plentiful sites of inland Saxon settlements, and from the archaeological layers and artifact locations, cohabitation went well before ones that would make sense as an invader sites. Oh yeah, okay, yeah, that makes sense, yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. Fascinating stuff. Yeah, well, I mean, to use the island example from last time, you do have, for example, the Norse and Irish, especially in places like Dublin. Historically, they cohabited, they intermingled, they married into the Irish world, and then, when the arrival of the Normans in the later years, you have the Normans again sort of doing the same thing of cohabiting and marrying into Irish families and sort of becoming a part of Irish society and integrating into Irish society rather than just simply being a conqueror, essentially. Normans being Latin, Vikings. Yeah, so just a clarification. We're talking about Norman England, which is typically people kind of... It's one of those weird terms where, yes, the Normans conquered England, but at that time, people... I'm also stumbling on it here as well, where I'm saying Normans, but I mean English. Whenever you see a Roman emperor with a beard, you know that he's a Greco-Bo. Yes. Yes, so Greek fashion, including stuff like facial hair, as well as clothing, had an impact on all the way up to the imperial family during the Roman Empire. Alright, I'm kind of moving on from the topic of Dark Ages. Okay. Sorry, moving on to the second part. So, why do historians dislike the term the Dark Ages? Before we get into that, I'll just briefly introduce the concept of historiography. And I definitely didn't do this slide just because I wanted to include this artwork, which is very nice artwork. It's the Allegory on the Writing of History by Jacob de Witt in 1754. So it has... This is me, guys. This is a historian. He's writing history, and you have wisdom looking on and offering guidance, and then you have truth looking on from up above, watching over her, over the historian, and the little cherubs helping out as well. Because that's me, guys. I got my butt out. I got my butt out sitting in the chair right now, talking about history, and then I've got a cool woman in a suit of armor looking over my shoulder, and then a naked woman floating above me. There you go. Historians have it good. Exactly. So yeah, if you don't know the term historiography, if you've never heard the term before, historiography is essentially the study and the writing of history. It's what historians do. Or if you've ever had to do a history course and have to do history assessment, etc., 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 and you're wondering why you're spending most of the time having to argue about historians rather than the actual history itself, that's why. It's historiography. So it's specifically focusing on stuff like interpretations of history and data to fit a theory that a historian has that maybe contradicts someone else's theory, essentially. That's all historians tend to do, which is arguing about interpretations of history. And so yeah, that's historiography. How do you know what actually happened when people are always lying? Exactly, that's a problem with history. We have to evaluate the validity of sources. And that is often very difficult. So, why don't historians like the term Dark Ages? Well, the straightforward point is that it's a very unfair and reductionist characterization of 500 years. And it's very ignorant, right? It's basically just slapping a label on 500 years of history. If you can imagine 500 years of maybe where you live, imagine 500 years of your country and just being like, "Poof, this is what it is," like in one word or two words essentially. It's poof, Dark Ages, right? Very ignorant, very sort of reductive, and very sort of. It has a pejorative and negative term, right? When people think of a Dark Age, they're thinking of negative things, and so historians don't like that, right? And so during this time in European history, many technological and societal innovations occurred, which contradicts the trope of the Dark Ages, which depicts it as an uncomplicated, uncivilized society of brutes, which just didn't exist. Like, yes, you have in the migratory periods, but the people in the migratory periods weren't just uncivilized society of brutes. They had society, they had culture, they had religious beliefs, they had spiritual beliefs, they had, they had more to them than just unga bunga, I kill you because you're different, right? As a Hungarian, my ancestors was just a slightly bit uncivilized. You say that, but, Hungary is a land that has been settled by invaders numerous times, right? And so you have all these different cultures interacting with each other, and it's not necessarily just conquering for the sake of conquering. Like, these people, they fought for a reason, and they wanted to find a home for themselves, and they had their own beliefs, which, differed from other people's, right? So, one of the big problems about our concept of the Dark Age is the decline of the Western Roman Empire. And unfortunately, a lot of people think 476 happens, bam! Europe is a wasteland. It's like the nukes have gone off, right? Rome falls. Everything is in disarray. Europe is has returned to instantaneous sort of like horrible conditions that are just full of dead people dying, plagues, invasions, raiding, all these sort of terrible times, and that's just not true. So what happened in 476? The fall of Rome is in 476 by the invading Visigoths. Or is it just the Goths? I can't remember. And so you have essentially, instead of thinking as the Dark Age as just a sudden shift, okay, Rome ends, Dark Age begins, you have a period of decline. The Roman Empire had been in a downfall since, or the Western Roman Empire specifically, had been in a period of downfall since like the early 200s. So this is a 270-ish year period of decline, essentially. You can't then just say, oh, Rome ended, ergo society is now crap in Europe, right? The decline in Western Roman society, or Western European society, was a long decline. It took many, many years for it to happen, and then essentially as Rome became increasingly weak, people stopped relying on the central power of Rome to protect them, and so they rose up and fought for their own sort of path, essentially. They had insurrections, they split away, they fragmented away from the empire and had their own, because they believed that instead of relying on Rome that could no longer protect them because Rome had become so weak, they, fought for their own, sort of continued survivability. So what is typically, because for most people, when they talk about the Dark Ages, they're most likely including the 500s, so the 6th century. So we're going to be talking about the 6th century a lot in the next few slides. So the decline of the 6th century, because there was a decline in Western Europe, but it wasn't a Dark Age. That's the important point to clarify. Whilst there may have been decline in Western Europe, it was not an overarching, broad era that lasted 500 years that encompassed all of European history. You have specific areas, mostly former areas of the Western Roman Empire, undergoing societal, population, cultural decline, but that is a temporary thing that is a temporary process. It is not something that lasted 500 years. It is normally, like, when people talk about it, they're talking about, say, 600 to 700. By the time you get to 700s, you have these areas recovering, and in some places even thriving. And that's just in Western Europe. You are ignoring literally everything else in the world. You're ignoring the Byzantine Empire, you're ignoring the Islamic world, you are ignoring China, you're ignoring India. You have massive empires across the world, all still existing, all still creating technological innovations. But you have people think, oh, it's just the Dark Ages, isn't it? There's nothing there. Everyone living in mud huts and shoveling and living on a farm and, I don't know, dying in some battle because some angry guy came and raided and they defended their home and died. And, like, fighting with pitchforks, essentially, right? And plagues, right? But obviously there were plagues. So, reasons why there was a 6th century decline in Europe. There are a few things. So there was volcanic instability, which is called the volcanic winter of, I think, is it 536? I think it might be 536. You have the plagues, namely the Justinian plague, which you might know as the bubonic plague, also known as the Black Death. So the Justinian plague was essentially just the Black Death, except 800 years earlier. And then you also have the failure of some of the successor kingdoms of the Roman Empire, namely cultures like the Visigoths, who didn't manage to live up to the standards that the Roman Empire could. But again, you are trying to sort of, I don't know, here's a football analogy. Sir Alex Ferguson builds up Manchester United to be like the greatest team of all time in football, British football. And then he steps down. He says, I've had enough. I need to retire. He chooses David Moyes to be his successor. Everyone's like, yay, David Moyes. He's going to do a great job because he did a great job at Everton. He gets appointed at Manchester United. It all goes to shit because all of a sudden you have new people in charge who don't know what they're doing. And Manchester United just goes, explodes, goes, oh no, everything's terrible. And so you have that period happening in which the Roman Empire is replaced by its successor, and they can't possibly live up to the expectations of the Roman Empire because they just don't have the amount of, like, administrative complexity available to them that the Roman Empire happened. You also have the dealing with the decline that was undergoing in this period. You have the Visigoths. Okay, how do you tax people who are dead? You have a population decline, which reduces the amount of taxation that you make, right? And so you can't rely on traditional taxation as a method to raise funds for the treasury, essentially, which we will get to in a little bit. So, that's going to happen to throughout history, or throughout sort of the Western Empire, or Western Europe, I should say, is you have some successor states don't succeed, which is, probably to be expected. They inherited a pretty crap situation. But that's not to say that all successor states were, or successor powers were terrible and, full of barbarians and blah, 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 blah. And then finally, another thing is that we don't really rely on, we don't like the term Dark Ages, because specifically in the past, the Dark Ages term could be used to refer to a lack of sources. We now have those sources, and we continue to uncover new sources. We also have access to archaeological evidence, which is something that our earlier historians didn't really get to rely on. They didn't have access to the same amount of data that we do nowadays. So to refer to it as a Dark Age because we simply don't know enough about it is a misnomer. Because we do know. We know much more now than they did back then. So the modern use of the term Dark Age is flawed. In the past, maybe you could argue, oh, we didn't have the sources. But nowadays we do. So that's why historians nowadays move on from the term Dark Ages and use terms like late antiquity. Are we confusing the Visigoths and Ostrogoths? Maybe, because I'm going to be honest, they're all Goths to me. Anyway, any questions? So would you say that that in the past we were living in a historical Dark Age? I'm saying in the past, the terminology Dark Age may have been more applicable than it is nowadays. Was a lot of the neglect of Roman infrastructure works due to a loss of knowledge? No. So a lot of so I know what you're specifically referring to. I'm guessing stuff like aqueducts. Most of those were destroyed in sieges. So if you're not aware, a lot of the aqueducts, especially going into Rome, a lot of them were destroyed during sieges. And so Rome, as a result, is a city that was reliant on importing of goods to keep it going, if you're not aware. Like, the population growth of Rome was based on immigration. There was no natural growth. So you have people essentially being removed from their fresh water sources because the aqueducts got destroyed, right? Is there an actual time that we could call the technical Dark Age? So historians tend to nowadays not use that. Is it true that written records were typically less common in this period? Yes and no, because we still continue to uncover new sources that helps sort of build up our concept or knowledge base of that time period. Because we do now have written sources. It was a decline. Aqueducts were destroyed. They couldn't afford to fix them. Yeah, well, it's expensive. Very expensive to build an aqueduct. The Romans were, for lack of a better term, cracked, let's say, when it came to infrastructure. And the people that survived them didn't necessarily have the same amount of resources because they didn't conquer anywhere near as much as the Romans did. What was the other question? Yeah, we now know more about the post-Roman Western Europe than pre-Roman Western Europe, but no one calls that a Dark Age, which, yeah, is an example. And yeah, so the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths. So I'm talking about both of them. Obviously, the Ostrogoths are who, I believe, who Belisarius conquers, and then the Visigoths were the ones who managed to survive for a little bit in Iberia, but again, didn't manage to live up to the standards or sort of, survive in any way that the Romans used to, right? Because they inherited a kind of a bad situation, sort of. Would a term like the English Dark Age still be in use for the Arthurian periods where records are closer to myth? Ooh, I think even British historians who focus on quote-unquote the British Dark Age, they do also have a different name for it. That's the thing, right? And also, I don't necessarily know about the intermingling of Arthurian legend with British history. I'm actually not sure how much it does intertwine, because I don't know specifically how much impact it has had on British history. This isn't a question, but Carthage deserved it. Here, historians refer to the period in Greek history prior to the Archaic period as Dark Age. Thought that would be a bit of a tangent. Oh yeah, no, so we talked about that. Yeah, so the Greek Dark Age refers to the Iron Age Greek history. So nowadays, historians just refer to it as Iron Age Greek history. Is there any reason why Gildas's manuscript survived, but the others, which might have been made at the time, didn't? Oftentimes it's just a little bit of luck, and also perhaps what the contents of the manuscripts had, right? You have, during this period of time, you have members of the clergy are the ones who are writing these texts and copying the manuscripts and copying texts to record them. And they were selective. They picked and chose which sort of things that they wrote down. And so you have things that maybe disagreed with the Christian church, that maybe a clergy member would think, oh, I don't think I should write this, and then simply doesn't write it, and then it's lost to time, right? These are all possible sort of situations, right, that could have happened, essentially, to result in certain works surviving and certain works not surviving, right? Well, they've copied mundane things like tax records. Oh God, I'm not sure. I don't think they did necessarily. I would have to look that up. You do get facts and figures getting copied, but oftentimes that's because it's in relation to whatever the author is writing about, right? But yeah, if there's no other questions, I don't know if we need to move on. We do have weather records, yeah, because people wrote about the world around them, including the weather, right? Does the first point not seem like an isolated demand for rigor? Like the Warring States period is fine, and that spanned for 200 years and only happened in China? Yeah, so that's kind of, again, we were talking about that at the start, right? Is that the unfair categorization of all of medieval history as a dark age is what historians have issue with. The only things that stand the test of times are the ones that we have multiple copies of. Exactly, right, yes. Yeah. Most of the time, it's you need to have, like, someone copying it and then someone 100 years later copying that, because, the... what's the word I'm looking for? Essentially, the writing utensils and, like, the quality of the paper and everything, oftentimes just didn't survive through time. A few mundane records we have from Antiquity are virtually all modern discoveries. Yeah, so a lot of our Roman, a lot of stuff that we have about Roman sort of statistics about, oh god, there's stuff like water supply in random cities in the Roman Empire being like, oh yeah, so this noble household got this much water, this Roman household, household had this specific amount of water that they bought because they had like water licenses and all sorts, and then there's also description, like, arguments about whether that was even real, because there was, again, this is a tangent about the reliability of historical sources. Anyway, moving on. Were there any dramatic single event losses or dramatic amounts of written knowledge during the Dark Ages? I don't think so, but I don't know. I don't think there's any sort of like great tragedy akin to like the burning of the Library of Alexandria, for example. Okay, moving on. So we've talked about why historians don't really like the term the Dark Ages. So again, going into the continuation of the point, the Dark Ages, or essentially Europe after the fall of Rome. So, as I previously touched upon, the Roman Empire was extraordinarily large, and it was also a very complex institution that had unified numerous groups of like ethnic groups, languages, religions, local cultures into one overarching Roman identity, which, when the empire fragments, you have these different groups, these different polities, all becoming isolated and having their own sort of identity. And then, of course, conflict emerges between the different groups, right? And so that sort of network that the Romans had built was reliant on trade, right? So it was essentially a trade network as well as an empire of cities, right? You have these settlements throughout the empire that were all connected through trade. Most of these settlements relied on goods coming in and out of these cities throughout the empire to sustain itself. For example, lead was exported from Iberia and brought over to Rome. We know a lot about the export of lead from Iberia to Rome because we have examples of ships sunk in the Mediterranean that, either ship records that are, still exist at the bottom of the Mediterranean, or even weirder, is examining the amount of lead that is detected in the Arctic, in the ice in the Arctic. And scientists/historians use the data of examining lead, the percentage of lead in the Arctic, to determine how much lead was being transported across the Mediterranean to Rome and then sinking. Because it's not necessarily an exact amount of knowledge about how much lead we have, of how much lead was actually being transported, because we don't actually know specific figures. It's an estimation or approximation based on how much actually sunk into the Mediterranean. Because the idea is they probably needed this much lead to, create new buildings, etc., pipes, blah, 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 blah. They needed this much lead, and we have this much lead present in Antarctica, ergo we have this amount of, you can extract that information to determine how many ships had sunk in the Mediterranean during this time frame, and then extrapolate from that data the amount of overall exports. And so one of the crazy things is that talking about lead exports to Rome, for example, we have less ships sinking in the Mediterranean during the 300s. And so historians just kind of have to assume, there are less ships sinking, that must mean there was less overall exportation. It doesn't necessarily mean, they just got better at sailing. The ships were able to survive the journeys more. They don't take that sort of analysis, which, you would think, it could just be that they were sailing in a more safe manner. They weren't risking, rough seas and to get from Iberia to Rome. No, it's just there just must have been less boats overall exporting lead. That would have been a leap of logic too far. But that's just an example of using historical evidence in a way that kind of, we build up evidence, but we're not sure exactly, right? So yeah. What was I talking about? Oh yeah, so that was about Rome. Sorry, I just went on a tangent about Roman trade. So yeah, as I said before, the city of Rome and many other cities across the Roman Empire relied on immigration to grow. That is a continued trend, including into the Eastern Roman Empire / Byzantium with Constantinople, which we'll get to in a little bit. So when you have the empire fragmenting into smaller, less organized, less complex, still complex kingdoms, but less organized, and a decline in population due to conflict and as well as emigration to safer areas of the world, you have less people to tax, right? So you have less funds available to you, and you have these empires or kingdoms operating on much smaller budgets, and so they're not able to, let's say, operate as higher level as the Romans used to, essentially. But yes, this process didn't happen all at once, and as I had mentioned before, decline had been, the Roman Empire in the West had been in decline for at least 200 years prior to the fall of Rome, in 476. And so just how people moved to America for a new life away from the conflict in Europe, people moved from west to east in the Roman Empire. So you have people in these, in the western part of the empire, so in Iberia, in Italy, in, I think in Britain as well, in France, You have the people moving from these areas, which are becoming more and more destabilized and needing to rely on themselves for their own protection. You have the people moving from there to the safety of the Byzantine Empire, right? Or the Eastern Roman Empire. So this is why Constantinople ballooned in population with estimations, I think 500, I think 500, 600. You have the population of Constantinople being estimated from anywhere from 250 to a million, 250,000 to a million people, which is an insane amount of growth in a very small time, considering prior to its founding in 330, you have a relatively small settlement in that area, right? I think prior to it becoming the new capital by Constantine, I think it was a small town rather than an actual city. So you have these populations moving. So that is an sort of an explanation for some of the population decline that occurs in the West. And so yeah, population movement should also ring a bell for this time period, which we did talk about earlier, the migratory period. So you have these different people emigrating from or moving through Western Europe, and to an extent a little bit of Eastern Europe, pushing through, fighting the Romans, fighting the Byzantines, and pushing into these areas and trying to find homes for themselves, essentially. So you have the Huns, you have the Ostrogoths, you have the oh god, I'm sorry. The legend is in German, so I apologize. But you have all these different peoples who are pushing into the empire, and in essence, these are not peaceful movements, right? You have people being pushed away from their homes because they flee, oftentimes, as I mentioned previously, from this area of the world into this area of the world. Because these areas in the West were seen as increasingly unsafe. So they moved over to the East. Hence why Constantinople and other parts of the Byzantine Empire balloons in population, right? So you have this sort of migration that happens, and these people end up settling in various different parts of the Western Roman Empire. And at this point, in some areas you got like some of these movements are finishing well after the Roman Empire collapses, and so yeah, that these sort of movements happen. And then, you have other reasons why people move to the east. Ta-da! You have Justinian's conquests. So Justinian, after, all of the instability and turbulence of the migratory period in which people are en masse either dying or moving away to escape the violence, you have that followed up by Justinian also invading and conquering these areas. So he conquers all of Italy up until... I guess this would be like the Savoyard-ish area. He conquers southern Iberia. He conquers North Africa, so like Tunis, modern Tunis area. And so during this time frame, you have even more violence, even more death. You have the Ostrogoths getting wiped out. You have I think the Visigoths also kind of get a bit of a pounding, I think. So, you have another sort of, like, this is a period of, I think, it starts in, like, the 200s. Some of these migratory periods end in the, mid-500s. So Justinian is happening mid to late-ish 500s, essentially. And you have this, you have conflict, again. You have the Byzantines invading and them expanding their territory back into, Western Europe. But this doesn't come at without cost, right? You have loss of life. You have population decline because people are being killed. You have population decline because people are fleeing for their lives, right? The foundation of places like Venice, for example, appear as a result of the invasions of the migratory period forcing the people of Ravenna, for example, into the lagoons of Venice, and that's why Venice comes to pass, essentially. So yeah, this is going into this slide is going to go into about the population decline. So I figured this was a funny title. I apologize for the pun. So dude, where's my Western European population? And so with population decline is associated with cultural decline. Obviously, should probably come hand in hand. You have less people, therefore you have less skilled people. You have less doctors. You have less scientists. You have less orators. You have less writers. You have less people, essentially, who are producing great works, right? Either because they've run away or they died, right? You also have other issues. You have the volcanic period, the volcanic winter of 536, which affected crop growth across Europe, not just in the West. You have I think it was called the little medieval ice age or something around this time. Basically the 6th century in Europe is just all around not a great time to be alive. It's a pretty miserable time, but things get better. But at the time, it was pretty bad. Yes, Italy becomes heavily depopulated. Conflict takes its toll on the local population. And so, you have I apologize it's in German, Völkerwanderung. I apologize, but it's just called the migration period in English. That's the German name, because obviously Germanic peoples were involved. So you have your Franks, you have your Goths, you have Vandals, Lombards, Huns, all raiding multiple times across history. Thousands upon thousands of people are dying over and over and over again through the violence. You then have that followed up by Justinian himself, and just coming in and taking over all of Italy. But by that point, you have Rome, which had shrunk from a population of over 1 million a few centuries earlier to down to the size of a small town, about 30,000 people. But these are, it's more like Velka. O is more like Okay, so Velka. Thank you. Apologies, I'm not fluent in German, as we have learned through my pronunciation of mercenaries from the 15th century. Anyway. What a terrible time to be alive. Yeah, it's pretty bad. It's pretty bad. So you have Rome suffering from multiple lootings, multiple besieges, famine, the aqueducts get destroyed, and so it's just not a place that is inhabitable. So where do the people go? They go elsewhere. They either die or they move. And so you have Justinian's reconquest forcing populations, again, moving to the east. And then following that, you also have Justinian's plague, which was the bubonic plague. So before the Black Plague happens in the 1300s or 1200s, you have Justinian's plague, which was Procopius, not Precipicus, different person, who's an eyewitness of the events in Constantinople at the time. He writes about how 5,000 people were dying every single day in Constantinople when the plague was at its worst, which I think was a stretch of about 4 months. So if you times, you times 5,000 times, what is that? 160 days? 160 days times 5,000. You have how many people potentially dying? Obviously, take numbers in history with a grain of salt. Not great. And then, of course, we have the volcanic winter, which affected crop growth across all of Europe. I believe it's not specifically one volcano, not one massive eruption, but actually just a series of multiple eruptions that all sort of coincided and had a very adverse effect on the climate and temperature. I think I remember seeing a statistic that apparently the average temperature of Europe fell by 3 degrees or almost 3 degrees Celsius, which I think is close to 5 degrees Fahrenheit or something like that. So, that's a pretty significant shift in temperature, especially at winter. Is there an estimate of Constantinople's population in 541? Again, so they're estimations, but it's, I think, anywhere between 250,000 to like close to like a million, right? Why did Justinian start a plague? So it wasn't him that started the plague, it's just the people blamed it on him, and so they called it Justinian's plague. Any questions? I will hydrate, thank you. Hmm. Thank you. Yeah, I'll add that. Little Ice Age. Was there a pope yet? Yes. So the pope existed. When was the first pope? Was it the 400s? I think so. Because the pope existed in the time of Attila the Hun. Let me go check that. First pope. Well, technically, people are like, oh, St. Peter was the first pope. Suffice to say, people in the 6th century were having a bad time. Yes, basically, it was a like. I think there's some sort of like historian, when talking about the medieval period, was just like, yeah, if there was ever a time in history to not want to be alive, like the most miserable time to be alive, it's probably the 6th century Europe. It's a pretty bad time. It's a very bad time to just be alive in general. So yeah, if anyone else doesn't have a question, not the Little Ice Age. Yeah, I think it was like a little medieval Ice Age, or is it little medieval? I think it was medieval Ice Age, right? Terrible for architecture. Well, yeah, because people. So if you're not aware, the Roman ruins. Well, we will actually touch on this in a bit, but Roman ruins were often repurposed throughout history. Do post-Justinian Italians think of themselves as Roman? Yeah, well, the Byzantines still considered themselves Romans as well. Again, we don't really know how much population would have been left after. Um, we wouldn't know how much population from the like when Rome was retaken by Justinian or reconquered by Justinian. We wouldn't know like the cultural demographics of them because again, it's only like 30,000 people. So yeah, it's kind of, and it was like basically uninhabitable. It was pretty rough city to be in. It was not a great city to live in at the time. Um, did it have any long-lasting effects on agriculture? Yeah, so this, we will get to that. We will get to that. Actually, before I start on the next slide, I'm just going to run to the bathroom real quick. I apologize. Sorry, VOD watchers. Skip forward a little bit. I've had like 2 cups of tea and a significant portion of my water, so it's all going through me. So 1 sec. Let me know are you guys enjoying this so far? How are you feeling about the lecture? Give me a mid session opinion. Everyone thumbs up? Thumbs up? Interesting? Thumbs up? Very fun to listen to? Hey, I'm glad. Thank you. Thank you for the feedback. And also, if you do have any criticisms, please let me know. There'll be questions at the end. You are welcome to post any criticisms or questions then. But thank you. I just need to go to the bathroom. Whew. Hello. Oh, sorry. Yeah, no throwables just at the moment because it distracts from the stream. Did Christianity hit a dramatic low point or become like at risk during the migratory period? So Christianity was still getting established throughout throughout Europe. I just hit the chain of my earbuds. So you have to remember that during this time, the Christianity had only become the official faith of the Roman Empire in 330. So you still have, at this point, most of Europe is a mix of Christians and also pagans, right? You have these different faiths intermingling, and there's no sort of unified European Christian identity that exists much later. That's good. That it's a process that takes hundreds of years, right? My understanding is that Christians did think that Attila was one of the four horsemen of the apocalypse. I'm not too sure about that one. But Attila the Hun did not have a great reputation, let's say. Not the best reputation in the Western world. Even in the Byzantine world, because he picked a fight with them, I believe, at some point. So, if there's any other questions, if there's not any other questions, we can move on to the next slide, which I think we're getting towards the end. Yeah, we have about 6 or 7 slides left. 6, actually, I can't count. Considering the adoption of Christianity by the German population, I would say quite the opposite. What was the most common currency used at this time? Oh god, it probably would have been the Roman currencies. So, oh god, what was the Roman currency by the time of the fall of Roman Empire? Was it still the denarii? I'm not sure, actually. Again, I'm not a numismatic historian. I don't like coinage. I have PTSD from undergrad and even beyond that of like having to study coins and coin analysis and like interpreting cultural history through a little face on a coin. And I'm like, oh, I have bad memories of just like looking at coins and being like, oh, this particular portrait on the side of a coin represents the imperial family's perception of itself as being above the gods, etc., blah, 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 blah. It's not my funnest favorite part of history, I'm going to be honest. Anyway, sorry, moving on. Okay, so we've talked about, quote-unquote, the decline that occurred in the 6th century. Is Petrarch correct in his assumption or correct in his identification of it being a dark age? So, wait, hang on, sorry, sorry, my bad. I see a little bit of a mistake that I wrote. So yes, like the Enlightenment looked down on Petrarch and the Renaissance period for their reliance on religion and God, Petrarch also looked down on the world that he lived in, including the period that we were talking about, which is the 6th century and beyond. Because, as we have probably established by now, Petrarch did have a little bit of a bias. One might say he was a eeny little bit biased towards the Roman and Greek world because, well, he was a bit of a Romaboo, if we use some modern terminology. Don't know if I can ever get that published in a historical scholarly textbook, the concept of a Romaboo. But yeah, so he is definitely looking at the classical period with a sense of nostalgia and fondness, with rose-tinted glasses or whatever you want to say, that he wishes, the time that he lived in was like that. But that is to say, the classical world is this amazing, wonderful place, but that's not true. It was not, as I say in the slide, all sunshine and just philosophical debates about anything and everything. You know, there was conflict, there was warfare, there was um, multiple sort of terrible situations. You have widespread death. You have Alexander the Great going. Well, I mean that's technically towards the end of the classical period, but you have people like Alexander the Great just like massacring most of the known world at the time. You have the Greek city states just beating the ever loving crap out of each other. You have the invasion of the Persians into Greece. You have dealing with like a foreign power, etc., etc. You know, it's not the best time. Like you also have stuff like corruption, which you know Petrarch is looking down upon the Catholic Church because of people being corrupt in the Catholic Church, but like the Roman Empire and Roman Republic was pretty rife with political corruption, especially. You have like, hey, does anyone remember what happened to the Gracchi? They got beaten to death with like chairs because they dared to rock the boat and dared to shake the status quo. It's kind of like, you know, you have dictatorships, you have all sorts of absolute insanity that happens, especially during the Roman period, which, you know, Petrarch is just like, but it's really good because it's a Roman. um, and so you have this situation where when you call something a dark age, and you are basically just summing up vast swathes of history as dumb, barbaric, horrible time to be alive, full of idiots who relied on religion, and you have all of these like negative associations with a dark age. It's a pejorative term that you're essentially removing the agency from this time period, right? You don't examine this time period critically. You're not looking at the actual historical evidence. You are just taking the label of a dark age and just stamping it on history and just being like, yep, it was all bad, and then it got better. Right? So you're essentially ignoring history. You're ignoring the historical evidence that we have now, which is what historians are trying to correct, right? And trying to correct that perception that the Dark Ages were horrible and full of, well, misery and death. But they weren't. They were just as vibrant as every aspect of history. And so one of the big changes that you have in Roman society, or not Roman, in post-Roman society, which people look down upon, which doesn't make sense. So you have the abandonment of large cities, because all of a sudden these cities don't make sense, because the Roman world collapses, trade disintegrates, you no longer have the network of imports and exports coming from different parts of the empire, so these people need to fend for themselves, right? So how do they fend for themselves? So there is the rejection or the abandonment of large cities in favor of villages and small communes with smaller populations, and the introduction or replacement of trade and importing goods being replaced by subsistence farming. So people were now growing their own crops. They were living on the land. They had small plots that they could grow their own food. They could have their own animals. So you have land ownership being taken from something that the wealthy had to being available to everyone. You had people having their own properties that they could grow and live on and subsume on, right? You have the rejection of the noble elite being replaced by small communes that may have had like someone that they were, you know, loyal to and paid taxes to, but they had their own plots, you know, they had their own lands. These people were able to look after themselves and perhaps paid fealty or loyalty to a higher power who, you know, protected them or whatever, right? And so you have this new way of life that people are adapting to, right? It's not like the world just goes when the Roman world ends, and then people are like, oh crap, what do we do? So feudalism. So yeah, proto feudalism kind of is what is emerging at this time frame, right? It's not really ownership. That's saying that because you're paying rent, you own the apartments. You get what I mean, right? They actually live on a property that they have their house in, then they get to live, and then through some sort of system of ownership or payment or whatever, they get to stay there, and they are protected from outside threats because of loyalty or taxes or whatever. Anyway, proto-feudalism essentially is starting to develop in this time frame, right? You have, with the abandonment of large cities, populations are more spread out. You have what would be considered population decline because it's harder to quantify how many people are living, right? In certain areas because the population is now spread out. It is not centralized. It is now throughout, the countryside, throughout little different hamlets, villages, towns. Eventually you do get the build-up of settlements into bigger towns and then eventually the return to urban and city life. But for the most part, you have these cities where, well, not cities, sorry, you have these little villages, which, people are able to live on the land themselves. They weren't reliant on some sort of Roman villa where they had to, pay to grow their crops on it, right? I can't remember specifics of Roman villa life. Something I learned in high school. So yes, you have that. And so you have the world adapting to the new way of life. It's not just, poof, Roman Empire gone, oh crap, what do we do? No, the people adapt to the changes that they face. It's not just like, oh, now we live in mud and I don't know, you don't have just where is it? You don't just have, all of a sudden people going from this to this, right? You don't have just oh, now we're digging mud. You have people adapting to the land that they live in and the times that they live in and growing crops and harvesting, and, growing animals and livestock essentially, right? You don't just have, is it this slide? Yeah, okay. You don't just have oh, people going, oh, time to shovel mud or something, right? And so with that adaptation, you have the world that is becoming, at this point, increasingly Christianized because of the abandonment of cities, the institutions of the Roman world, which was things like temples, things like theaters, things like amphitheaters that brought people together, they were no longer relevant because people didn't need that. They didn't need to go to see a theater or a play or go to the forum to, hear people talk about the state of the emperor or whatever. Social and philosophical function, which was, through institutions such as temples, theaters, amphitheaters, that was replaced in the Christian world with the purpose, that was replaced with the local church. And the local church was exceptionally efficient because you didn't need these massive cities that, only so many people could live in these, crowded cities that people were then crowding into these things. You could have local churches everywhere. You did not need a massive building. You did not need these massive urban structures to house thousands of people. You could have little cities, little churches, essentially all across Europe. And so these people no longer needed to go to a temple. They no longer needed to go to a theater. They no longer needed to go to amphitheater. There was no gladiators because even by that point, in the 5th century, the gladiators had been banned in the empire. So entertainment, social, philosophical fulfillment was through the church. And so the old Roman structures were forgotten. They were repurposed for Christian medieval life. So you had these buildings that, the Romans had built these grand buildings. So what do people do? They use the infrastructure that had come before them and use it in the construction of things that they needed now, which was churches, which was towns, which was walls, which is early sort of Christian settlements. So it wasn't like an abandonment that Renaissance writers sort of depict history as being like, oh, people abandoned their classical roots. They abandoned the morals and beliefs of the Roman and Greek worlds, right? It wasn't an abandonment, but more that sort of time frame was no longer applicable to them because they didn't need to go hear about the Roman emperor. So why would you need to go to a forum to hear about the Roman emperor? You can go to your church and hear the local sermon and socialize. And so you have settlements being built around the church. And that's where these sort of villages would become like the focal point of a settlement became the church. It was important to all facets of life, and the previously seen as like by the Renaissance writers and thinkers that the Greco-Roman world was full of grandeur and amazing moralistic and philosophical debates and all that, but that just wasn't applicable to the Christian world now. So they simply didn't need it. There was no sort of abandonment of classical roots. It just simply wasn't applicable to them anymore. You don't need to learn about Plato. You need to learn about what the sermon in the Bible was for this week, right? You go to church to listen to the sermon. You listen to the priest. They don't need to know about, what Cicero thought about Julius Caesar, for example. So you have, this super streamlined system in which people were able to fulfill their sort of all these sort of like entertainment, social, philosophical fulfillment was through the church. And it was exceptionally streamlined compared to the Roman system, which took hundreds of years to build up, right? Because you had to build these cities, you had to build these great urban spaces that had to house all these institutions, right? And meanwhile, when the Christian world comes along, it's just like one building with a cross on it. And it's like, yeah, this is our church, and this is where people get their fulfillment from, right? So that's kind of where this is where historians talk about sort of like, does that sound like a dark age? No, it sounds like people merely adapted to the times that they lived in and simply relied on new sort of developments such as the church as fulfilling or having fulfilling lives, right? Was the church closest thing to large-scale leadership? Yes. You don't have like a unified... So the church wasn't like... You don't have like modern communication, which is having like everyone connected to everything and having all of the church be, on the same page at the same time. That's why you do get little different, like you get different denominations and different sort of developments in different parts of the world. But you do have the church and the Christian world being unified under the sense of, or the purpose of what the church serves to the local communities, right? So hopefully that makes sense. Sorry, I kind of rambled a little bit. Does that make sense? It sounds like a huge step back in terms of development. So the thing is, it's exceptionally easy to build a church compared to building a city, right? Think about how easy it is for a village to be fulfilled societally in whatever way you want to talk about, philosophically, morally, through entertainment, socially. You have all these, you have people getting that fulfillment through the church, right? It's exceptionally efficient because it's just one building with, you have one building which serves all those purposes and more to the local communities all across Europe, right? It depends on your definition of development. Yeah, so you have these, I guess, decentralization, and you have all of these communities that are able to grow and thrive, and through the moral guidance of the church, right? And so from there, these communities grow and expand, and then eventually you get back to towns, back to cities. And it's a process that is so much faster than ever the Romans did, right? Um, Developers they needed rather than directors from Rome. Exactly. Yes. Can we restart what I have missed? Well, we're 3.5 hours in, so probably not. I think it's about 3 hours, close to 3 hours. So hopefully this is all making sense. So basically, decentralization and local communities, small local communities, being much more efficient at fulfilling societal requirements that, like a classical Renaissance sort of Romaboo would decry as being, oh, it's not the same. But, for the people at the time, this was incredibly efficient. Incredibly efficient. So, any questions? It's better to plan cities and stuff around the decentralization rather than against it. A lot of it is just like, I don't know, there's the accusation of like being reactive versus adaptive, and I think this sort of system shows that the people of the early Christian Europe, and of like, I guess, a post-Roman era, you have people adapting to the world around them. They don't just think, oh crap, the planet is dying, the aliens aren't contacting us, the animals are leaving, do you need anyone else? You have the people realizing that they can build their own communities, and they don't need to worry about staying connected to Rome. They don't need to worry about what the emperor is saying. They don't need to worry about, oh, the grain tax is due, time to, hand over all my grain and all my money, and we need to pay for the armies that will protect us. I mean, obviously there was still protection needed, but it's just a much more efficient system compared to the Roman system, because you had, the Roman Empire was exceptionally complex, and it worked almost despite itself. It worked. So what came after was much more efficient, especially on local levels. So hopefully that made sense. If you have any questions, please let me know. I'll try and look at my notes and try and word it maybe more eloquently, but hopefully I've explained how the development of early sections. A bit of tangent. Have you heard of QGIS? It's an open source application where you can visualize data of geographical attributes. No, I haven't. No, sorry. Was it a dark age there? Or was it a dork age? No, I don't think the concept of a dork existed. You did just throw in a question. Is there a section on monastic orders? We've touched on monastic orders and clerical life a little bit earlier. I also touched on it just a little bit now, but I don't go into it too specifically. No. What was the other question? Oh yeah. How soon after the fall of Rome did the Christian church start decrying antiquity as backwards paganism, and did that include stuff like theatres and amphitheatres to push people more towards the churches? So, even during Roman time, even during like the Roman Christian time, you had Roman Christians looking down upon Roman pagans and Roman and Greek paganism, right? That is a process that was already occurring. Did that include stuff like theatres and amphitheatres to push people more towards churches? Yes. Well, like, the reason gladiatorial fights and gladiatorial entertainment was outlawed was partly because it went against, the Christian beliefs of the Roman Empire that was now prevalent, right? Why would that be a much more efficient system? From what you suggested, the reason for the Roman Empire's fall wasn't necessarily inefficiency, but rather the inability to sustain. Yeah, so it's the empire was sustaining itself because it was so large and so sort of enormous in scope and ability to sustain itself. So when that collapses and you have people fleeing the traditional urban society, people people move towards smaller habitats or smaller communes and living spaces that doesn't rely on lots of people all at once, right? The Roman system had the constant requirement for needing lots of people, right? It needed lots of people to keep the system going. Whereas when you decentralize into these smaller settlements, you don't need to have massive amounts of people to keep it going. People are able to grow food themselves, rear animals themselves, and they're able to sustain themselves, and therefore able to also sustain the local church, which is a lot more sort of efficient. Like, yes, there are elements of not needing. So you're saying it's not necessarily a loss of aqueducts and their technology. It's just simply people didn't need them. You don't need an aqueduct if you live in a tiny village, right? You need an aqueduct if you live in a major urban space, but you don't necessarily need that if you're living in, a tiny village with like 200 people, maybe, if that, right? What would Petrarch think of VTubers? Probably very confused. Early Christianity was pretty critical of all non-religious sources of entertainment. Yes. Wasn't there a big reason Roman fell off because they had stretched too thin? Yes. Well, I mean, the empire had become so unwieldy. That's why it essentially splits in two. Essentially, so you have East and West, and then West eventually collapses. East survives for another 1,000 years. Which again is another point about the Dark Ages, is completely ignoring anything happening outside of Western Europe. It's exceptionally Roman-centric. How well did the invading Germanic tribes preserve and adopt Roman culture and government systems? I believe the Ostrogoths, when they inhabited Rome, tried to continue that sort of Roman tradition. I don't know about government systems specifically, but I believe the Ostrogoths tried to maintain it and then eventually did get conquered. I believe the Visigoths in Spain failed to capitalize on the existing infrastructure that was available to them in Iberia. I don't think they did a particularly great job. That's not necessarily culture, but that would be more like an infrastructure, government systems, those sorts of things. I think they were just incapable of trying to fulfill the same sort of needs that the Romans used the Iberian region for, right? Okay. When did the Germanic or Gaul tribes start to convert to Christianity? Oh god. So you can't really talk about all of them in one fell swoop. It is a gradual shift, right? Just like how the Roman Empire technically doesn't fully Christianize. It had an official religion, which was Christianity, but like members of the empire were still, pagans. There were still regions of the empire that, when West falls, still believed in paganism. Even in the fall of the fall of the Eastern Empire, you still had people, I think, believing in paganism, right? You still had people attached to their old sort of classical pagan beliefs, if I'm not mistaken. You would want an aqueduct because of public baths? Yeah, but the settlements aren't, because urban settlements were so, they had to be specific areas, right? They were immovable. They weren't mobile, or you could say they were immobile, right? These spaces needed all of the resources to flow into them. If you are in a smaller village area with subsistence farming, you can do that anywhere. You can get water sources anywhere. Like, you can just have a settlement set up on a river somewhere, right? You don't need to be in this one specific area to live, which was the city, right? You have areas out, like, all over the place. People all over the place in these different settlements, right? Why did the Western capital move to Ravenna? Oh god. Wasn't it because Rome was kind of a poopy poop? Wasn't it just simply... Wasn't it simply Rome had fallen out of favor with the emperor, and so he was like, let's choose a different capital? I would argue that a decentralized system is not necessarily more efficient. Okay, maybe not efficient, streamlined. I guess you could argue that streamlined equals efficiency, but it's a much more streamlined process where you don't have to go to different places in a city to fulfill your social, philosophical, moral obligations. You just have one building, the church. You don't have to go to the amphitheater. You don't have to go to the theater. You don't have to go to the gladiator arena. You don't have to go all over the place, right? You can just go to church, and that's... you fulfilled all of your needs, essentially, right? But rather does not require the efficiency of a centralized system needs. What fell away with the aqueducts was efficient water transport. Yes, but there's also the development of adapting to the circumstances that they are in, and eventually the adoption and implementation of new technologies to help with the world that they lived in, right? Which is kind of the point, right? Empire-wide legal systems supported Mediterranean commerce. A move towards more localist economies was simply a necessity. Yes, exactly. Why were the aqueducts never repaired? Very expensive. Just very expensive. You need to have skilled miners, you need skilled technicians, and you need a lot of money to pay them and build them and repair them and maintain them, right? Sorry if this is already covered, but wasn't there a population decrease in Europe, and did it affect their viewpoints? Yeah, so there was a population decline. We have talked about the population decline that occurs in the 6th century and, I guess, 5th century. But that is not necessarily just because Rome goes poof. It's a lot of issues. There's a lot of causes that has resulted in a population decline, but simply because there's a population decline doesn't mean we have a dark age. Is Antiquity the better term for the migration period? Yes. Ravenna was also much easier to defend. Yeah, and you don't necessarily, need an aqueduct. If you're in a tiny village, you don't need an aqueduct, right? You don't need these massive infrastructure programs that needed to be maintained and built and funded and all that jazz. When you're in a smaller settlement that is a village, that is a hamlet, etc., you are able to live more efficiently, in quotations, because you don't simply need as much money, infrastructure, etc., to fulfill the needs of a society, right? So hopefully that makes sense. Oh my god, what the hell? Sorry, I just got a phone call from some random person. I don't know who that is. Okay, if there are no more questions, I will just take a sip from my tea, and then I'll move on to the next page, because we've been on this slide for about 20 minutes, I think. It's holistically more efficient to be less centralized. Essentially, yes. That's one of the advantages of being so decentralized. Okay, moving on, because we are almost at the end, right? I only have 5 slides to go. So, did Christianity result in an intellectual dark age? So we've talked about why the societal decline and the population decline hasn't necessarily resulted in a dark age, but has there been an intellectual dark age, which is, talking about abandonment of classical roots, over-reliance on, religious learning, etc., and that's resulted in a downfall, right? So, as we were reframing the idea of the abandonment of urban spaces to not be an abandonment, but more an adaptation to the new standard of, well, not new standard, but the new way of life that emerged following the fall of Rome, there was also no abandonment of education, right? There was no sort of people just becoming ignorant idiots who, didn't care about reading, didn't care about books, didn't care about anything to do with education, theory, morality, etc., philosophy. No, people still cared about those. And there was no blanket nosedive in learning or education throughout Europe. What did happen was that whilst the Christians were skeptical of what could be learnt from the Christian past, or the classical past, because it was a pagan past, it was a different religion, they weren't wholly dismissive. As we know from Petrarch, people still had access to classical sources, and people still read classical sources and spread classical sources and texts and thinkers and all that jazz, right? That still existed, even into the day of Petrarch. He did not just instantly rediscover classical theory. They were still produced. It's just the priority of what people needed was religious. It was people primarily needed religious texts. They needed things that were relevant to their own lives. There is no point spending time writing en masse a text that is about, let's say, I don't know, the morality of Romans, when people nowadays care about, religious teachings, Christian teachings, etc., etc. Sorry to rely on etc. too much. But hopefully you understand what I'm trying to say with these points. When decentralization results in a significant reduction in peak education? No. So you have to bear in mind that, and it does get to this in this slide, don't worry. But yeah, so manuscript production and the copying of classical texts did continue, not to the extent that it would have in the past, during the Roman period, for example. And there were issues where sources would have been lost, so they didn't have access to as many sources back then, perhaps. And they were also selective about what texts were copied, because, you have a theological sort of Christian view on these texts, and if there's stuff in those texts that, hey, maybe doesn't agree with Christianity, then, hey, maybe that doesn't get copied, for example, right? So things that promoted paganism, things that promoted different religious perspectives, maybe the Christian world wasn't exactly too thrilled to write about. But that's because people didn't need that. They needed to know about the Bible. They needed to know about Christian literature, because this was important to their societal values, their lives, their day-to-day living. It was important to the churches that they went to every Sunday. You get what I mean, right? And it's important to know that education, even from the classical time into the medieval period, was still limited to the wealthy elite. Education was exceptionally expensive. Teachers needed educating, and then you needed to pay them a lot of money to educate a lot of people. And so even though there was civic education in the late Roman period, it was only available to the wealthy elite. And so there is actually the example that the medieval era did educate more people, more commoners, more regular people than the Roman and classical period. And so more people in medieval times were available to or able to earn an education through the church, because the church as an institution would provide you education in writing, in reading, because they need people to write these manuscripts. They need people to write the Bibles. And so the common person did have an avenue, both men and women, to get an education. Which is revolutionary, right? The wealthy elite that was getting education in the classical period was almost definitely male-dominated. And so the fact that women could join a convent and earn an education as a nun was absolutely insane. Revolutionary, almost. Well, not probably revolutionary, but it was a concept that would have been foreign to a lot of people, right? You wouldn't have thought that people back in the day, like an average farm girl, could join a nunnery and all of a sudden or convent, nunnery, convent, um, and get an education, right? And yes, so churches would incentivize people needing to read and write. It's very important. How far into the medieval period did the Greek schools did the Greek schools get introduced? Oh, reintroduced. Oh, you mean like Platonism, etc.? Um, I mean, I think you're looking quite a while, right? I think even I think they existed for a long time, but were mostly located in areas around Greece and Iberia. Not Iberia, sorry, Anatolia. Those sorts of schools and systems, right? So yeah, ideologically and religiously, the people of 400 to 700 AD, especially in the Byzantine era, in the Byzantine world, saw themselves as a continuation of the rich and glorious past that was the classical era. Um, it wasn't necessarily a departure, um, like a wholesale just like cut off of like abandoning our past and moving on. It was more like, hey, this was good, but now we are better, right? And we are continuing the traditions. And that was more applicable to the Byzantine world. But then you also have this school of thought later in time during like the Renaissance period, where you have people like Petrarch who is saying that he was continuing the great works of the classical era, essentially, right? So yeah. Any questions? Any questions? So hopefully that helps answer the whole concept of it not necessarily being an intellectual dark age, because people were able to get educations. I think it's worth remembering that low plebs during the Roman period could write well enough to leave graffiti. So the people who are leaving graffiti were probably not necessarily plebs. I could be wrong. I could be wrong, but even then, even those people who are able to write, and there are examples I think of like Roman, at least a lot of the soldiers did. Yes. Well, because they needed to have their own signature, right? They needed to know how to write their own signature. So that was important. But I think a lot of people did not have access to reading and writing, and so like a lot of people in Roman times learnt things through oration, through seeing a person talking at a forum, seeing people at an amphitheater in a theater, for example, right? It might be perceived as a decline in intellect, might rather be a decline in critical thinking, since the Catholic Church did control what was being taught, and things like Aristotle was being taught and liked Aristotle a great deal more than he deserved. I mean, yeah. I mean, you can argue that because the church becomes so integral with education, that there is potentially, it is a different system, it is different values. It is not necessarily better than one thing or another. Like you have in the Roman time a lot of people being educated in a Greek way. What's to say that the education in a Greek way was not also seen as, controlling of values, right? The Roman education system, which was heavily influenced by Greek learning and Greek education, you can still kind of apply the same logic to they are learning one specific way and everything else is different and seen as insignificant, right? The church was only protective of scriptural ideas. You could think critically about everything else other than the church. Yeah, and so like you have another example of intellectual going against the intellectual dark age is that you do have innovations, you do have inventions, you do have um, things being created and invented in Europe, especially in the Byzantine world. And it's not like the Romans were literally weren't taught to literally deify their emperor. Yeah, right. They worshipped their emperor as a living god, essentially. Was the education system in this period still able to incentivize investigations and discoveries? If so, how? Um, I think it was not necessarily like incentivizing, but more like a necessity, right? So, like, for example, especially in warfare, right? You have militaristic advancements in technology because the escalation of conflict demands it, right? You have arms races, you have all these sorts of advancements that result in people needing different weaponry, new weaponry, right? Um, yeah, the church didn't become counter to science until things like evolution eroded the scriptures, and that's like Victorian industrial age times. Yeah, so you have a lot of like education and inventions being, I believe, propagated by the church, right? Um, and like I do have a list of, I think this is from, I don't know if this is appearing on stream. Okay, it's not. So I do have a list of like 30 Byzantine medieval inventions um, that I found on a Reddit post in the Ask Historians section because I was trying to find like a nice sort of list of things that I could mention. I believe it is sourced. But you have things like a lot of militaristic inventions. So you have Greek fire, you have handheld flamethrowers, trebuchets, body armor, advancements in incendiary and corrosive grenades. You have, what is this? The Solinarian, a kind of Byzantine arrow guide. You have the Paramerian, a saber-like weapon. You have inflatable siege ladders. What? That's crazy. You have the invention of the pendentive dome in the Hagia Sophia, which was, I think, in the 1600s, in the 600s. You have universities being introduced, such as the University of Constantinople, the Byzantine Suda, which is a form of encyclopedia. You have state-run hospitals, separate patient wards, female doctors, social services, orphanages, almhouses. You have all these innovations and developments through, quote-unquote, what would be considered the Dark Age, right? It just so happens it's in the Byzantine Empire or the Eastern Roman Empire rather than Western Rome. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you can you can't just like ignore the Byzantine world and say, oh, it was a dark age, because it's just completely disregarding everything else happening in the world, right? You can maybe isolate it to specific issues, but the broad terminology of the dark age of medieval Europe is just completely, and that's why historians don't like it, which is what I'm trying to say. So yeah, hopefully this all makes sense if we don't have any more questions about this. Can it be considered stagnant when compared to previous periods of the Arabic world? So actually, a fun thing about when I was reading into the Dark Ages for this topic, is there is also a counter thought towards the Islamic Golden Age as well, because the Islamic Golden Age didn't actually benefit all of Islam, right? It is a very specific area of the world that benefited from what we would previously consider the Golden Age of Islam, right? And so it's basically the same sort of logic behind why historians don't like the Dark Ages, because it's only specific areas that really have the issue. Say vice versa, people have issues with the terminology of a Golden Age of Islam because it only benefited certain areas of the Islamic world. How much did you miss? We are just about 3.5 hours in, so we're near the end. I only have 4 slides left. But yeah, hopefully that makes sense. Hopefully. Yes, I'm aware the deification was a political propaganda tool rather than a religious system for the emperors of Rome. The Byzantine Suda is so cursed because of the preserved records are so biased. Hey, well, that's a lot of records. Okay, so looping back to the original terminology of the Dark Age, right? We've kind of gone over I've kind of explained briefly, well, not briefly, I feel like I've explained in some way. There was no intellectual Dark Age. There was no spiritual Dark Age or religious Dark Age. And there was no necessarily population decline that was extended for a large portion, enough to argue that there was such a decline in people that for an extended period that it could be all considered a Dark Age, right? Because you have these areas growing. So what did Petrarch originally mean, right? If we go back to this slide where Petrarch is talking about the world around him and the things that he has issues with, can you guys think of what Petrarch is really after? In your own words, what do you think Petrarch is after? I'd be interested to hear what you guys think. He wanted an Italy that was less of a basket case. Exactly. He wanted Garibaldi. Exactly. You're getting it, guys. You're getting it. He wanted a less fractious Italy. He wanted unity. He wanted unification. He wanted, bam, Italy. He wanted the restoration of a unified Italy, right? This is what he was after. I'm glad you picked up on this. Born 500 years too early. Yeah. This is what Petrarch wanted. He wanted a strong, unified, imperial Italy, essentially, that was able to, restore the olden glory days. This is what he wanted. He wanted some sort of power to provide all the sort of societal needs that he wanted. He wanted a unified Italy that protected the citizens, that protected the people, that protected, the legal system worked, wasn't reliant on corrupt popes, etc., etc., etc. This is what he wanted. He wanted Italy. And so, yeah, he was one of the earliest humanists. So, his work was essentially co-opted for nationalism and Protestantism. His works, in particular, was considered like proto-nationalism and proto-Protestantism because of its criticisms of a fractured world and criticisms of the Catholic Church. So there you go. Ta-da! So yes, as we continue the points of the Dark Ages, but it's actually just some areas of Western Europe. So the concept of a Dark Age, to kind of sum it all up, the discourse of what the Dark Ages affected were almost entirely just British, Italian, French, Iberian regions, right? Pretty much everywhere else in Europe was not in the same sort of Dark Age that they are focusing on, because it's focusing on the areas after the fall of the Roman Empire, mostly. And these different areas prospered and, rose and fell in different ways, at different times, and it is stupid to assign any sort of broad societal decline globally or even across Europe. Areas such as Scandinavia and Germany, in particular, underwent massive growth and transformation across during the time period of like 500 to 1000 AD, which is the typical association of what the Dark Ages were, right? So we're even going beyond the 6th century. Using the term Dark Ages completely ignores the achievements in the East of the Eastern Roman Empire, the rise of the Islamic world, and its spread of its many innovations. China, India, full of empires that rose and fell. Tang dynasty, Sui dynasty, I forget what came after the Tang dynasty, I think Liang or something. India had the Gupta Empire, you had all of these, massive powers that rose and fell and replaced by other massive powers that rose and fell. Song Dynasty? Yeah, that sounds about right. I don't know. Chinese history is beyond me. um, yes, there were, so there were times in which history had these great empires and they fractured and they were replaced by unified empires and they fractured. It is impossible for us to have, whilst we live in a time of relative peace, there are empires that are and powers that are rising and falling all throughout history. And so you can't just say, oh, this bad thing happened, therefore everything was bad, right? And innovations, inventions, ideas continued to spread throughout the world. Which a quote that I grabbed because I thought it was interesting was it said the quote-unquote dark ages were a time of dynamic development, cultural creativity, and long-distance networking. Which is to say the period from 500 to 1000 AD, you have new developments in culture and especially in networking and trade. And that the humans of the time were adaptive, they weren't reactive. They adapted to the world around them, and they adapted to the changes that arise because of things like the Roman Empire falling, things like plagues happening, things like the volcanic winter that happened. People adapted, or they died. And they're still here, so clearly everyone was able to, adapt. People were able to survive, and then eventually they got through the tough times of the 6th century. Yes, the indomitable human spirit, exactly. And there's also evidence of the dark ages of 500 to 1000 AD is the development of material culture and people hoarding material wealth. You have development of material belongings. You have production, essentially, infrastructure of things that demonstrates a high degree of sophistication that you wouldn't necessarily associate with a period that is called the Dark Ages. And so there's this final quote, which I quite liked, so I figured I would include it. But it is hopelessly redolent of Renaissance and Enlightenment prejudice. That is the term, the Dark Ages. It altogether underestimates the impressive cultural vitality and enduring spiritual legacy of an entire period that has come to be known as the late Antiquity. I just like that quote, so I wanted to include it. But that's by Harper. I'll have a full bibliography at the end if you'd like to read it. But yeah, any questions? Any questions on this slide? Oh, I finished my tea. Justinian still got his ass kicked by a comet. Justinian got his ass beat by a lot of things. A plague, for one. His people, for another. -1 stability. But yeah, if there's no questions, I will move on, because we're almost at the end. Would it be correct to refer to this as the English Dark Age? So yeah, so that's we talked about that earlier. Is that the English Dark Age is a more applicable term to refer to a specific area in history in a specific part of the world. The issue that historians have with the term Dark Ages is that it is a broad stroke upon a vast part of the world, aka Western Europe, and for a large period of time, aka 500 or so-ish years. Some people even say 500 to 1,000, right? Okay, so, moving on. It wasn't even that dark or an age. So, issues with the concept of a dark age, or the Roman, or the, sorry, I'm getting all muddled in my own head here. So, the Dark Age arises from, essentially, Roman biases in Petrarch, Roman biases in Reformation thinkers, Reformation academics or scholars. It rises from Catholic scholars later, in response to the Protestant Reformation. It arises in 18th and 19th century historians, especially in the time of the Enlightenment, which looked on upon the period of the Roman Empire as a great achievement, as, you know, the pinnacle of society, the pinnacle of history. And so that has basically shaped our understanding of history for the last, give or take, 2 centuries, right? 2-3 centuries. Because historians in the 18th and 19th century really like Rome. Really, really like Rome. And so in doing so, they are ignoring all other aspects of history, especially Byzantine history or Eastern Roman Empire history. That was neglected for a long, long time. It's only until last century that, you know, in more modern scholarship, that the Byzantine Empire is really getting its, I don't know, its acknowledgement in academia. And so for a lot of people, for a good 200 or so years, the hyperfixation on the success of the Roman Empire and when it falls and there being, you know, a decline, people just instantly brushed it aside as like, oh, Rome fell and then a dark age swept across Europe, right? But that's not true. And so yes, the fall of Rome did not instantly result in a sudden transformation of Europe into a backwards dystopia where peasants rolled around in the mud all day. Which is a funny quote that I found. I forgot to attribute it. I apologize. And the Renaissance, which helped propagate the notion of Roman cultural and moralistic elitism, it wasn't even actually original. The Renaissance was built upon Byzantine achievements like 2 centuries earlier, like I think around 10th, 12th century. And so instead of being a sudden rediscovery of classical thought, it was a culmination of developments centuries and centuries and centuries in the making. And even then, even though, yes, when Rome fell, the successor states failed to live up to the expectations, mayhaps, or were nowhere near as successful as the Romans. But that's a tough act to follow. But, you know, once they sort of collapsed, it was followed by a period in which very, very important kingdoms emerged, and empires. So the Merovingians, the Lombards, and most importantly, the Holy Roman Empire. Oh, glasses toggle. Cool. Ta-da. So hopefully that makes sense. Which is neither holy nor Roman. No, of course not. But it was so you're talking about, like, hey, Romans are super duper influential, except with the notion that, oh, everything after it didn't come close or was anywhere near as important. But no, you did. Like, not even that long after the fall of the Roman Empire, some, you know, less than 500 years, you have things like the Holy Roman Empire emerging, right? That doesn't just poof into existence. It is a continual process of development of history and events, and, like, these events happen because of what comes before it. There's no sort of, yes, there was a decline in the 6th century in Western Europe, but it wasn't a dark age. Which is the point of historians. And so to write off all of 5th to 10th century, or I guess 6th to 11th century history as a dark age is simply irresponsible. So there you go. Any questions? Because guess what, guys? It's reductionist. Yes, exactly. Any questions? Because I know there's a glasses toggle. I put them on. What about the Kingdom of Franks? Exactly, right? Kingdom of Franks were a very important, albeit short-lived kingdom that unified and then fragmented and then eventually resulted in things like the Holy Roman Empire, for example. Why is it called dark? Because it is referring to a lack of moral and cultural stagnation. Or it was a cultural and moral stagnation in comparison to the Roman era or the classical era. Did you cover the Black Death? No, so that's beyond the scope of the lecture today. Have there been any accounts from the eastern side of the world regarding the Dark Age of the West, and I mean Far East? I'm not sure. I'm pretty sure there would be Byzantine sources talking about the West. I would have to look into them, but I didn't do that for today's lecture. I'd be very surprised if there wasn't. I don't think I'm convinced, but it's interesting to hear the reasoning. Really? Okay. Do you have sources or recommendation to learn about this era? Yes, I will get to that. So yeah, in conclusion, guys, because we are actually done. I didn't think it would take this long. I thought this lecture would only be 2 hours at most, to be honest. Popular culture continues to propagate the myth of a dark, miserable, colourless society following the fall of the Roman Empire. Also, the term Dark Ages does sound really cool. The original intended meaning by Petrarch of the Dark Ages referred to a cultural and moral decline in medieval Europe, compared to the elite days of the Roman and Greek worlds, or classical worlds. The term Dark Ages is Eurocentric and Roman-centric and ignores all other developments outside of Western Europe. And whilst the 6th century was a time of upheaval, it was still a time of great innovation and progress for the 500 or so year period that was previously dubbed dark, right? Great projects still were created during this period. I forgot to mention it, but if you've never seen it, there is the church in Ravenna that was built in the 6th century, which is incredible. So exactly what I'm talking about in that it's this incredible church in 6th century Italy, which is seen to be well in a dark period of decline and population, is just depopulation, and you wouldn't think great projects such as that church would be created, but it was. And so the terminology Dark Ages refers to a reductionist approach to history, a reductionist perspective on history that not necessarily overestimates, but prioritizes the importance of Roman history at the expense of everything else, which is just not true. History still continued. People still continue to live, adapt, develop, thrive in this period. And so to call it a dark age is to be reductive and, just overly simplifying a very complex time in history, because it is a complex time in history. Every time in history is very complex. And you shouldn't simplify history with vastly broad, incredibly broad strokes, 500-year period, Dark Ages, right? So yeah. The final point is, because I'm sure there are people who are like, okay, so what do we call it then? So, historians will always argue on what to call things, especially when it comes to periodization, because people love to argue, especially historians. It's literally their job. I will talk about my personal preferred term, which is late antiquity. There is also the suggestion of early medieval. But they're kind of interchangeable, and they all mean the same thing. The only, one of the main things that people disagree on is when one period ends and one period begins, because different historians, different people put different emphasis on different events, right? But again, when you're putting emphasis on events as the Antiquity era ends in the fall of Rome. But like, what about the rest of what would be considered antiquity, right? That's all the same, right? They still existed past the fall of Rome, right? And then there's, arguments that, oh, late antiquity ends with the rise of Islam. But like, what about the rest of the world, right? It's all just like, it's too complex to try and break up history into easier to understand topics, because it's trying to simplify history, but history is complex. Is Renaissance a misnomer as well? Yeah, because people call it a Renaissance era, but it's more of a Renaissance movement, which we did briefly touch upon earlier. Isn't Britain still a dark, miserable, and colourless society? Are we still in the Dark Ages? I mean, things aren't great there, but hopefully things get better. Yeah, so like, there is definitely an approach with the Dark Ages to treat it as like a post-apocalyptic scenario compared to the Enlightenment of the Roman Empire, but like, that's just not true. It's just not true. We have sources. We have so many archaeological sources and historical texts now available to us that helps illuminate and brighten up the quote-unquote Dark Ages. So that is why historians do not like the term the Dark Ages. And so hopefully I have maybe not necessarily convinced you, but presented the article in a way that it makes sense as to why people no longer, or historians argue, you shouldn't use the term Dark Ages and should instead use something else. Thank you for listening, guys. Yay! Thank you, guys. So, I did have one thing that I was gonna maybe end on, if I was gonna be more dramatic, but I don't have exactly dramatic timings. But I was gonna play the bit in Little Dark Ages by MGMT. The bit where the beat breaks down. That one. Yeah. I was gonna play that, but I don't have like I should have made another slide that yeah, the bit's not gonna work now. What I will do, however, is go bibliography. I apologize, this is not in alphabetical order. Wait, why did I do that? I'm probably gonna need to raise that sucker up. I'm probably gonna need to raise this sucker up, because we're gonna also go in here and make this font really small. I will go get my bibliography real quick. I don't know if I got everything. These were just all the notes that I grabbed. I had recorded. There might be some things that I'm missing. I apologize. But here you go. Oh my lord, it's too small because I posted without formatting. A paste without formatting. What? Why is it so small? Yeah, it's a bit long. Oh, it's a bit long. Let me try and figure this out. Where is spacing in the lines? Where is the space? Where is line breaks? Oh, there we go. I didn't have it selected. Single. Really? Are you sure that's not double spacing? Anyway, if you want to read through it, there's quite a few. I apologize. Very simplistic references. Forgive me for being lazy. I didn't do full on Chicago 16. I just put name, date, title. Apologies for the simplifications. But yeah, I'll put a full list in the description of the YouTube video, which will have proper formatting, and well, not proper formatting. It'll be in alphabetical order and be a lot more easier to follow. But yeah, there you go, guys. Thank you for coming to the history lecture. If you would like to ask any questions, now would be a good time.